In a world full of noise, worries, and endless to-do lists, falling asleep with a calm mind can feel impossible. But the gentle wisdom of Buddhist stories reminds us that peace is never far away. These calming tales, filled with kindness, stillness, and quiet truths, are here to help the mind rest and the heart relax. Each story holds a soft lesson, guiding us to let go of tension, release heavy thoughts, and return to the simple joy of being. In these 3 hours, you will drift into deep sleep, not just through rest, but through healing peace. The silence of the bamboo grove. In the quiet shadows of a bamboo grove near Kosambi, the Buddha once shared a lesson about stillness. Not the silence of a place, but the silence of the heart. A monk asked why his meditations were restless, even though he sat in the most peaceful surroundings. The Buddha told him about a time the bamboo grove had been filled with noise, not from wind or animals, but from the thoughts of the monks within it. There is something haunting about the kind of silence that makes one aware of every thought. The leaves in the grove didn't rustle, the air didn't stir, and yet the minds of the monks buzzed louder than any storm. One monk sat cross-legged, eyes closed, but his mind wandered to a conversation earlier that day. Another was replaying an argument from weeks ago. A third thought of how far he had to go in his practice. From the outside, they looked serene, but inside, they were far from still. The Buddha noticed this and called them together the next morning. He said, "You seek peace from your surroundings, but you bring noise with you. Until the noise within you quiets, no place, no matter how silent, can make you still." One young monk, confused, asked, "How do we find this inner silence if even this grove cannot help us?" The Buddha looked at the tall bamboo. It stood unmoving, perfectly still under the morning sun. He walked to one, gently tapped it, and said, "This bamboo does not try to be silent. It simply is. It is not thinking of being straight or tall or hollow. It has no thoughts to disturb it. That is why it is peaceful." The monk did not understand at first, but that evening he sat again beneath the bamboo and began to notice something he had missed before. Not the birds, not the wind, but the space between thoughts. At first, they were brief, like tiny gaps in a stream of sound. Then, they grew. The more he paid attention to those quiet spaces, the less interest he had in the noise itself. He returned to the Buddha days later and said, "Master, I heard something strange in the grove today." The Buddha smiled and asked, "What did you hear?" The monk replied, "Nothing, but it was the deepest sound I've ever known." The Buddha nodded. "Now the grove is working, not because it became quieter, but because you did." The lesson spread quietly among the monks. Many still struggled, still sat fidgeting in thought, but they began to stop searching for silence outside themselves. Instead, they listened to the space between their own thoughts, the space between their breath, the pause between heartbeats. That is where the true bamboo grove lived, not in the forest, but in their awareness. What this story teaches is simple but often forgotten. Silence is not something we find. It's something we stop disturbing. The world may be loud, the schedule full, the future uncertain. But underneath it all is a stillness that has never been broken. It is not earned. It is not achieved. It is returned to. it is remembered. Just like the bamboo doesn't try to grow straight or make no sound, we too don't need to force peace. We only need to stop feeding the noise. In this way, even a chaotic room can become a bamboo grove. Even a restless night can become sacred ground. And even a mind full of racing thoughts can begin to hear something deeper. The silence that has been there all along, just waiting for us to listen. The monk who slept in the tiger's den. One day, far from any village, deep within a forest known for its danger, a young monk wandered alone. He was not lost. He was seeking solitude. But solitude in this forest was not gentle. It was wild, thick with vines, echoing with the cries of animals, and home to one creature feared by all, the tiger. Locals warned travelers to never walk those paths after dusk. But the monk, guided by his teacher's lesson on fear, decided to stay in the forest through the night, not to test his courage, but to test his mind. By sunset, the monk found an old stone shrine, abandoned, moss-covered, open to the jungle. He sat cross-legged inside, back straight, and began to meditate. Hours passed. His breathing slowed. His thoughts wandered, then returned. Just before midnight, he heard something, soft at first, like the weight of a heavy body brushing leaves. Then, the unmistakable sound of paws. A tiger was circling the shrine. His heart pounded. His eyes remained closed, but every part of his body trembled. The ancient fear awakened, of pain, of death, of helplessness. His mind screamed, "Run!" But there was nowhere to run. There was only now. So he did the only thing he had been taught. He watched. He observed the fear, the noise, the heat in his chest, the urge to escape, but he didn't move. The tiger came closer. He could hear its breath now, deep, slow, heavy. He imagined its eyes glowing in the dark. He imagined teeth, claws. But still, he sat. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The fear didn't grow. It began to shift. The more he looked at it without running, the less real it seemed. Not because the tiger disappeared, but because the terror was not in the tiger. It was in his mind. The Buddha once taught, "What we fear is not the thing, but our thoughts about the thing." The monk began to understand. He was not in control of whether the tiger would strike, but he was in control of how much his mind panicked in the face of it. And so he did something unthinkable. He laid down. Right there, on the cold stone floor of the shrine, in front of the tiger's presence, he rested his head and fell asleep. When he awoke, the sky was pale with dawn. The forest was quiet. The tiger was gone. No scratch, no bite, no harm, just silence. He stood, brushed off his robe, and began the long walk back to his monastery. He said nothing when he arrived, but his presence said everything. Calm, grounded, unshaken. He had walked into the mouth of fear and found stillness instead of screams. In time, the story spread among other monks, not as a tale of bravery, but as a lesson of surrender. Not to danger, but to awareness. The monk didn't become fearless. He became intimate with fear, and in doing so, he disarmed it. He showed that it is not the tiger that holds power, but our resistance to the unknown. The story teaches us that peace is not the absence of danger. It is the absence of panic in the face of it. It is learning to lay down. even when the mind begs us to run. It is knowing that we can't always choose what surrounds us, but we can choose how we meet it. Some nights bring noise, threat, restlessness. But the soul learns to sleep, not when the world is safe, but when the heart stops fighting what it cannot control. And in that moment, even a tiger becomes part of the silence, the wind that forgot its name. Long ago, in a small village near the foot of a mountain, the wind was known to speak, not with words, but with feeling. When it rushed through the trees, people said it was angry. When it blew softly over the rice fields, they said it was calm. When it howled over rooftops, they said it was wild and searching for something it had lost. But one year, the wind changed. It stopped howling. It stopped dancing. It slowed so much that even the leaves barely moved. The villagers noticed this stillness and began to wonder. The trees whispered less. The grass barely swayed. The wind had not disappeared. It had simply forgotten what it was meant to do. In a quiet monastery on the edge of that same village, an old monk sat beneath a Bodhi tree, observing the world like a mirror. He noticed the wind's silence and said aloud, "Even the wind can lose itself when it tries to become something it is not." A young novice nearby asked him, "How can the wind forget its own name?" The monk smiled. "When it stops moving freely," he replied, "when it tries to be what it thinks others want it to be." The old monk told the boy a story of a time when the wind had been proud. It wanted to be seen, to be known, so it tried to roar like a lion to prove its strength. Then it tried to carry the scent of flowers to prove its gentleness. Then it became cold to seem powerful, and warm to seem kind. In chasing all these roles, the wind became tired. It no longer knew what it truly was. It had stretched itself thin, trying to please everything around it. The novice sat quietly for a moment, then asked, "So, what should the wind have done?" The monk replied, "The wind should have remembered its nature, to move, to carry, to pass through without clinging. That is enough." That night, as the young novice went to bed, he thought about the wind. He thought about all the times he had tried to be many things, perfect, impressive, wise, even joyful, when inside he felt lost. He realized he too had forgotten his name, not the one others called him by, but the name behind all names, his true nature. Outside, a gentle breeze returned, just enough to stir the edge of a leaf, not trying to impress, not forcing anything, just being. The Buddha once taught that we suffer not because of who we are, but because of who we think we should be. Like the wind, we bend ourselves into roles, strong, kind, smart, useful, until we forget how to simply exist. But true peace is found when we release the need to perform, to be seen, to prove. When we drop those masks, the stillness beneath returns. We remember how to breathe, not for show, but because breath is life. The wind that night didn't roar, it didn't whisper, it just moved gently through the trees, and for the first time in many nights, the entire village slept soundly, because something had returned, not a sound, not a storm, but a remembering. The clay cup that never broke. In a quiet village, surrounded by hills and lotus ponds, there lived an elderly potter known for making simple clay cups. His hands were rough, his back bent with age, but his work was known for something curious, No one had ever seen one of his cups break. Even when dropped, even when cracked, they somehow held together. Some said he used a secret glaze. Others believed he chanted over the clay before firing it. But when asked, the potter would only smile and say, "It's not the clay, it's how it was formed." One day, a young monk visited the village and heard about these unbreakable cups. Curious, he went to the potter's workshop. The room smelled of wet earth and ash. Rows of drying clay lined the shelves. The monk bowed and asked, "Master, how do your cups never break?" The old man looked up, wiped his hands and said, "Because I let them break before they ever leave this room." The monk didn't understand, so the potter invited him to watch. The next morning, the monk sat silently as the potter shaped a fresh cup. With gentle pressure, the clay began to rise on the spinning wheel, but then the potter pressed too hard. The cup collapsed. Without a word, he started again. This time the walls were too thin. Again, he crushed it down. Over and over, the monk watched the potter destroy what he had just created. But each time, the potter's face remained calm. No frustration, no regret. Finally, the potter made a cup that held steady. Strong walls, balanced shape. Before placing it on the shelf, he tapped it with his knuckle and listened. "That sound," he said, "tells me it's ready. It has been tested, not on the outside, but within." The monk was quiet, and the potter continued. "People think something is unbreakable if it never shatters. But that's not true. This cup could break. Any cup could. But because it was shaped slowly, because it was allowed to fail, reshape and fail again, it holds strength inside. That is what makes it endure." The Buddha taught something similar to his disciples. He said that the strongest mind is not the one that never feels pain. It's the one that has sat with pain, watched it rise and fall, and continued. Like the cup, a peaceful mind is not free from cracks. It is familiar with them. It does not fear being dropped because it knows its shape was formed by falling. The monk returned to his monastery with a small gift from the potter, one of those simple brown clay cups. He kept it on his shelf, not to admire, but to remind himself of something deeper. That strength comes not from being untouched, but from being remade. Each time he struggled in meditation or failed in patience, he would hold the cup and remember, this too is part of being shaped. Over time, the other monks began to ask him about the cup, why it mattered. He never told them it couldn't break. He just smiled and said, "It broke many times before it ever held anything. That's why it holds so well." The story of the unbreakable cup spread quietly, not because of magic, but because of truth. It touched those who were tired of pretending to be strong and instead taught them how to become strong, through surrender, through patience, through the willingness to fall and begin again, not once, not twice, but as many times as it takes to become whole, not perfect, just steady enough to hold life without spilling. The temple that refused to echo. High in the hills beyond the reach of most travelers, there stood a temple unlike any other. It was carved from dark stone, surrounded by mist, and known for one strange thing: it never echoed. No matter how loudly one spoke inside its walls, no sound returned. Pilgrims found it unsettling. Monks who visited often left in silence, unsure of what the temple meant to teach. But the few who stayed long enough discovered something rare, something the Buddha himself once described as the silence deeper than silence. One day, a restless novice, full of questions and noise, climbed the long path to this temple. He had heard the stories and believed them to be legends. Every temple echoes, he thought. Even the caves sing back your voice. But when he arrived and stepped inside, he called out, "Is anyone here?" His voice fell flat. No reply, no whisper from the stone, just stillness. He wandered the halls and shouted. He clapped. He even struck the bell in the center room. It rang, yes, but it felt like the sound went inward, swallowed instead of shared. Confused and slightly unnerved, he sat down near the altar and closed his eyes. What kind of place refuses to respond? He wondered. He stayed the night, then another, then a week. And in that strange, silent place, something began to shift. At first, he noticed how loud his own thoughts were. He realized that his mind echoed all the time, repeating fears, old arguments, dreams, and judgments. And each time he waited for silence outside, his mind filled the space with noise. But in the temple, the absence of echo held him like a mirror. It didn't respond. It didn't affirm. It simply let him hear himself. The Buddha once told his disciples, "The wise do not seek answers from the world. They listen so deeply that even questions dissolve." The temple did not echo because it wasn't built to answer. It was built to absorb, to hold, to invite a person into their own silence. The novice began to change. He stopped speaking aloud. He stopped asking the temple to respond. Instead, he listened, not with ears, but with stillness. And slowly, his thoughts began to quiet. The arguments faded. The self-commentary softened. And one night, as he sat under the moonlight streaming through a stone window, he realized something. He no longer needed an echo. He no longer needed the world to reflect him. He was enough, complete in the silence. Years later, others who climbed to the temple would sometimes find a quiet monk sweeping the stone steps. He never offered grand teachings. He simply bowed, smiled, and returned to his task. But many who visited said the same thing. The place made their thoughts louder at first, and then it made them disappear. The temple that refused to echo became known not for its silence, but for what its silence revealed. It taught that the need for reaction, approval, validation, even from stone, was a craving of the unsettled mind. And once that craving faded, the silence stopped feeling empty. It began to feel full, not of sound, but of presence. To this day, no one knows exactly how the temple was built to resist echoes. Some say the stone was special. Others believe it was designed by a great master. But those who understand know the truth. The temple didn't refuse to echo. It simply asked, "Why are you shouting into the world when the answer has always been within?" The girl who gave the moon, her smile. In a small village by the river, where lanterns floated on water and old songs drifted through bamboo trees, there lived a young girl named Lila. She did not speak much, not because she couldn't, but because she felt that words were too heavy for the kind of sadness she carried. Her parents had passed when she was small. She lived with her grandmother, who told her stories each night about the Buddha and the stars, hoping they would soften the silence that had grown inside her. But still, Lila rarely smiled. She moved through the world gently, like a shadow that didn't want to disturb the light. One evening, during the full moon festival, the whole village gathered at the river to release floating lanterns. It was said that if your heart was full of good wishes, the moon would hear them. Children laughed. Couples whispered. The elderly sat with warm tea, watching the water glow. But Lila sat quietly on a stone near the edge, holding her unlit lantern in her lap. She didn't know what to wish for. She had nothing left to ask. Suddenly, a voice came from beside her, a traveling monk who had been passing through the village. "Why don't you light your lantern?" he asked. Lila shrugged. "I don't have anything to give. Everyone else has dreams. I have emptiness." The monk smiled, not in pity, but in deep understanding. He reached into his robe and pulled out a small mirror. He held it up to the moon and then turned it toward Lila's face. "You say you have nothing," he said softly, "but the moon sees something you've forgotten. Look." She looked. Her face was pale in the moonlight, tired eyes, soft lips, and then something unexpected, the smallest curl of a smile, a memory rising from nowhere. Maybe it was the wind, maybe the quiet, maybe the monk's kindness. But there it was, her smile. The monk whispered, "Sometimes we think we are empty because we are measuring the wrong things. The world tells us to look for grand dreams, big plans, endless joy. But the Buddha taught that the smallest act, done with presence, is greater than a lifetime of wanting. Even a smile offered from a quiet heart can be enough to change the sky." Lila lit her lantern, not with a wish, but with a smile. A real one, gentle, undecorated. She placed it in the water. It floated toward the center of the river, where the moonlight touched it. And in that reflection, she saw something she hadn't felt in years: peace. From that night on, the villagers began saying the moon shone a little brighter whenever Lila smiled. Not because she had made the sky different, but because her own sky had begun to change. The sadness was still there, but it no longer closed her heart. It became part of her quiet strength, a reminder that even the softest presence can heal, even the smallest light can guide. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." Lila never needed to say much. Her presence became that word, and those who saw her smile remembered something sacred, that we don't have to shine loudly to be seen by the moon. Sometimes it is the one who thinks they have nothing to give who ends up giving the most. And the moon, ever watchful, continued to reflect her gift every night it rose. The monastery with no door. In a quiet valley blanketed by fog and wildflowers, there once stood a monastery that had no entrance, no gate, no marked path, no door, just high stone walls weathered with age, and a tall bell tower that rang softly each morning and evening, even though no one ever saw who rang it. Travelers often passed by and wondered. Some knocked on the wall, hoping for a secret passage. Others called out, hoping someone would hear, but no reply ever came. The monastery remained silent, still and untouched. It became a legend. A place where only the ready may enter, some said. A home for ghosts, others whispered. But the truth was more strange and more beautiful than any story. One day, a young wanderer arrived. He had walked for weeks through mountain trails, carrying nothing but a cloth bag and a question that burned in his heart. What is peace, and how do I find it? He had studied scriptures, he had practiced posture, he had chanted in temples and listened to teachers, but the calm never lasted. His mind always stirred, chasing approval, fearing failure, aching to be seen. He reached the monastery near dusk and stood before its high wall. No one greeted him. No sign pointed the way. He walked around the entire structure. No crack, no gate, no keyhole. He sat on a flat stone outside, frustrated and tired. And then the bell rang. A soft, deep sound that moved through the air like breath. The young man froze. His mind quieted for the first time in days. The sound didn't call him in. It called him back. Back to the moment. Back to his breath. Back to the part of him that wasn't searching. He stayed. He didn't try to enter again. He simply listened. Morning after morning, he woke with the bell. He swept the grass. He cooked rice over a fire. He meditated by the wall. Days became weeks, and something began to change, not outside, but within. His thoughts softened, his restlessness dissolved, and the constant feeling of needing to arrive somewhere faded. One afternoon, he was sitting with his back to the monastery wall when he heard a faint sound behind him, the soft slide of stone. He turned. A door he had never seen was now open. Without thinking, he stepped inside. The monastery courtyard was still, lit by sun and scattered leaves. A single monk stood there, robes simple, hands folded. He smiled and said, "You have already been living here." The young man bowed, confused. "But I was outside the wall." The monk shook his head gently. "Peace is not inside these walls. It is inside you. The monastery opens only when you stop trying to enter, when you stop chasing it and begin embodying it." The Buddha once said, "The mind that seeks is the mind that suffers. The mind that stops and sees clearly is already home." From that day on, the young man stayed, not because he was finally allowed in, but because he finally understood he had never truly been locked out. The monastery with no door teaches a quiet truth, that most of the gates we try to enter, peace, love, clarity, worth, do not exist in the world. They exist in presence. They are not unlocked by force or achievement or effort. They open when the search ends, when the noise settles, when we are no longer begging to be let in, but are sitting still enough to hear the door open on its own. The fisherman who threw back gold. In a quiet coastal village where the sea whispered secrets to those who listened, there lived a fisherman named Arun. He was known not for his strength or his nets, but for his calm. While other fishermen raced out with the sunrise and shouted over the waves, Arun moved silently, always alone in his small wooden boat. He didn't catch more than others. Sometimes he caught less, but his eyes held a peace that made people wonder what he saw out there on the water. One morning, before the sky had even turned blue, Arun set out as usual. The ocean was still, barely breathing. He cast his net without force, letting it sink with its own weight. Hours passed. The sun rose. He pulled in a few small fish. Then something strange happened. His net grew heavy, heavier than ever before. With effort, he hauled it in and found, tangled in the mesh, a golden statue. It was shaped like a fish, but shone like the sun, covered in symbols Arun didn't recognize. The weight of it was not just physical, it felt powerful, the kind of find that could change a man's life. The villagers would have called it a miracle. Merchants would have paid him enough to buy a fleet of boats. His days of simplicity would be over. He could have servants, a house on the hill, anything. But Arun just stared at it. Then he looked at the water. Then, without a word, he tossed the golden statue back into the sea. Later that evening, when he returned with only a few fish, the villagers mocked him. "You threw away gold for fish?" one shouted. "Do you want to die poor?" asked another. But Arun smiled softly and said, "I didn't throw away gold. I returned what didn't belong to me. I caught a symbol, not a meal." They didn't understand. How could they? That night, Arun sat by the sea, the waves brushing the shore like a lullaby. A young monk who had been walking the coastal trail stopped to rest nearby and overheard the whispers about the fisherman. He approached Arun and asked gently, "Why did you let it go?" Arun replied, "Because it was too heavy, not just in my hands, but in my heart. I would have spent the rest of my life guarding it, fearing it would be taken, or worrying what to do with it. But this," he said, holding up a small, clean fish, "this feeds me and frees me." The monk smiled. The Buddha taught that clinging is the root of suffering. Most believe that applies only to pain, but it applies to gold too. The two sat together, saying little. There was nothing left to explain. The story of Arun spread beyond the village. Many laughed. Some called him foolish. But a few began to understand. They started noticing how tightly they clung to what they thought would make them happy. A ring, a title, a memory, a plan. And slowly they began letting go, piece by piece, until their own hearts felt lighter. What Arun did was simple, but it was rare. He chose freedom over possession, silence over praise, and because of that, he slept deeper than the wealthiest man alive. Not because he had nothing, but because nothing had him. The sea, in return, continued to feed him gently, not with gold, but with enough. And that, for those who truly see, is the greatest treasure of all. The feather that floated for 100 years. In a quiet corner of the world, where the river ran slow and the air moved like breath, there was a story the villagers told, but only in hushed tones, and only when the wind was soft enough to listen. They said that long ago a single white feather had fallen from the sky and never touched the ground. It had floated, not with direction, not with purpose, but with ease, for 100 years. And in that century, many who saw it claimed their lives had changed. The feather wasn't large. It wasn't golden or glowing. It looked like any other, delicate, weightless. But there was something different about it. It never rushed. It never landed. It just moved with the breeze, untouched by storms or seasons. And the Buddha once said, "Be light in the world, not to rise above it, but to fall gently through it." One summer, a young monk named Sona heard of the feather while traveling through the countryside. He was tired, not from walking, but from trying so hard to be good, to be wise, to be still. Every meditation felt like work. Every chant felt forced. His mind fought with itself, trying to be silent. He believed enlightenment was a mountain to climb, a prize to earn through effort, through control. When he heard of the floating feather, he scoffed at first. What could a drifting feather teach me? But curiosity tugged at him. So he searched. Through villages, over hills, across fields where the feather had last been seen. Then, one morning, beside a calm stream, he saw it, suspended in the air like a whisper, barely moving, not rising, not falling, just there. Sonar stood still. He reached out, but the feather drifted gently away. No sudden motion, just a shift, as if the air had made a choice. He followed it, but it did not lead. It floated toward a grove of trees, then over a still pond, then beside a sleeping deer. Hours passed, but in watching it, something unexpected happened. His breath slowed, his steps softened, his mind, usually crowded with noise, began to quiet. The feather did not teach with words. It did not explain. It just was, effortless, unattached. And in that effortlessness, Sonar saw something deeper than any sutra he had read. The feather did not cling to wind or resist it. It did not control where it went. It surrendered to movement without losing its center. The Buddha had once told a similar story of a leaf in a stream. Be like the leaf, he had said, floating not because it is weak, but because it trusts the water beneath it. That day, Sonar finally understood. He had tried to conquer his thoughts. He had fought for stillness. But peace does not come from force. It comes from release. He no longer chased the feather. He bowed to it and let it drift on. Then he sat beneath a tree, closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't try to silence his mind. He just let it float, like the feather, without judgment, without control. Thoughts rose and passed. Emotions came and went, but he remained, still, like air. They say the feather still floats somewhere, seen only by those who've stopped chasing, by those who walk slowly enough to notice. And those who see it rarely speak of it again, not out of secrecy, but because no words can explain what it reveals. It is not a symbol of mystery. It is a mirror of what the heart becomes when it no longer resists the wind. The feather that floated for 100 years reminds us that true peace is not found in pushing or in grasping or in perfection. It is found in the gentle art of letting go, of floating with life, not to escape it, but to trust it, to surrender, not in weakness, but in wisdom, and to remember that even the softest things can carry the deepest truths when we are finally light enough to listen. The dream that watched itself. In a quiet temple tucked between misty hills, there was a young monk named Jaya who often struggled with restless sleep. Every night, his dreams stirred him awake, sometimes joyful, sometimes strange, sometimes frightening. He would wake with his heart racing, unable to tell what was real and what was not. No matter how still his body lay, his mind never seemed to rest. One morning, after yet another night of wandering through his own thoughts, he went to the elder monk and said, "Master, I do everything right during the day. I chant, I sit, I breathe. But at night, my mind won't stop running. I dream and wake and dream again. I feel trapped inside my own head. What do I do when even sleep feels like suffering?" The elder monk looked at him gently and said, "Tonight, Don't be the one inside the dream. Be the one watching. Jaya blinked in confusion. But how can I do that when I'm asleep? The master just smiled and walked away, as he often did when words had done enough. That night, Jaya laid down with a new intention, not to fight the dream, not to chase it, but to simply observe. As sleep came, he felt himself slipping into a strange awareness. He was dreaming, yes, but somewhere deep inside, a part of him remained still, like a candle in a dark room, flickering but not blown out. In the dream, he found himself walking through a forest that wasn't quite real. Trees shimmered like light, the ground moved like breath. Normally, he would have reacted, run, explored, questioned. But now, he simply watched. He didn't say, "I am walking." He saw, "Walking is happening." He didn't say, "I am scared." He saw, "Fear is appearing." The dream unfolded, but it was no longer in control, and for the first time, the dream lost its power. The fear faded. The confusion softened. The images kept shifting, faces, colors, voices, but Jaya was no longer tossed around by them. He was the sky behind the clouds, the watcher, the awareness. When he woke just before dawn, the room was still dark, but inside he felt clear. A kind of peace that didn't come from the absence of dreams, but from his relationship to them. He smiled, not because the dreams had stopped, but because now they didn't own him. Over the weeks that followed, Jaya continued this practice. Each night he let the dreams come, and each night he watched them like floating lanterns drifting down a river. He learned something the Buddha had once said but never fully understood until now. All phenomena are like dreams, illusions, bubbles, or shadows. Most people think they are the actor in their dreams, but the real shift comes when you become the audience. When you don't wrestle with what arises, but gently observe it, the mind stops reacting. And reaction is what keeps the suffering alive. Jaya's rest became deeper, not because his dreams vanished, but because the struggle within them did. The fear of what the mind might show him no longer held weight. He realized that even the strangest visions were just clouds passing through a sky that never moved. The other monks noticed something had changed. He was quieter, not from sadness, but from depth. He listened more, smiled more, and when asked how he slept, he would say, "Peacefully, because now I let the dream dream itself." And that was the secret, not escaping the mind, but learning to sit beside it, not silencing every image, but watching them drift across the screen of awareness, knowing that no matter what appears, the one who watches is always free, even in dreams, especially in dreams. The sandalwood tree that cried at night. In the heart of a quiet forest, far from roads and footsteps, there stood a sandalwood tree, unlike any other. Its bark was rich with fragrance, and its leaves whispered softly even when the wind was still. But villagers who lived nearby told a strange story, that on certain nights when the moon was high and the forest lay silent, the tree would cry. Not with sound, not with tears, but with a gentle mist that rolled off its bark like dew, carrying a scent so deep and mournful it stirred something in the chest, something ancient and tender. They called it the sorrow of the tree, and no one knew why it wept. One day, A young monk named Tissa wandered through the forest, seeking a place to rest and reflect. He had been struggling with something he could not name, a quiet ache that never left him. His teacher had told him, "You carry a grief that is not loud, but heavy. Go sit with the world. It will show you what to do with it." As night fell, Tissa came upon the sandalwood tree. Its trunk rose tall and proud, but its presence was gentle, almost shy. He sat beneath it, and soon he began to smell it. The fragrance rich like memory, sweet like kindness, but with something deeper beneath it. A sadness that didn't belong to sorrow alone, but to something softer, something human. Then he felt it, the mist rising from the bark. Not rain, not fog, but something else. It curled through the air and wrapped around him like breath. And though no voice spoke, the monk felt as if the tree was telling a story, not in words, but in emotion. He placed his hand against the bark and closed his eyes. And in that stillness, something inside him loosened. Not all at once, not with drama, but like a knot slowly coming undone. His chest tightened and tears filled his eyes, not from pain, but from recognition. The tree was not crying for itself. It was crying with the world. The Buddha once said, "Compassion is the trembling of the heart when it touches suffering." Tissa understood. The tree did not cry because it was weak. It cried because it felt. And in feeling, it healed. All its life, the tree had given fragrance, even to the axe that cut it. It had offered shade, even to the hunter who rested before killing. It had shed its bark gently, releasing more perfume, not less, the more it was wounded. And in the stillness of night, when no one watched, it released the sorrow it had absorbed, not for pity, but for peace. The monk stayed for several days. He did not chant. He did not study. He simply sat. And each night he let the fragrance of the tree carry his pain away, not erase it, but soften it, hold it, let it breathe. When he returned to the monastery, his teacher looked into his eyes and smiled. "You've met something gentle," he said. "Now be gentle with the world." The sandalwood tree that cried at night reminds us that strength is not always loud, and healing is not always sudden. Sometimes the deepest comfort comes not from answers, but from presence, from something or someone willing to sit with pain without trying to fix it. Like the tree, we too can learn to be soft without being broken, to release without being empty, to feel deeply without being consumed. And maybe, on the nights when no one is looking, to let go of what we've held for too long, quietly, gently, like a tree exhaling its sorrow into the stars. The beggar who forgot to beg. In a dusty town where the market was loud and life moved quickly, there sat a beggar at the edge of the temple gate. Every day he held out his hand, not for food, not for wealth, but for something, anything, that would make him feel seen. People passed by, some tossing him coins, others pretending not to notice. He never spoke, he never smiled, he just waited, as if the world owed him something it had long forgotten to give. But one morning, something changed. A visiting monk walked by, and, instead of dropping a coin or avoiding his gaze, he sat down beside the beggar and said, "Brother, what are you waiting for?" The beggar was taken aback. No one had ever asked him that. He thought for a long moment and replied, "I'm waiting for someone to save me." The monk nodded and said, "Then may I ask you to do one thing today? Don't beg, just watch." The beggar frowned. "If I don't beg, I don't eat." The monk smiled. "You might not eat what you're used to, but you may be fed in a new way." That day, the beggar sat in the same spot, but with his hands resting on his knees instead of outstretched. The first few hours felt strange. People passed him by and seemed confused. Some stared, some ignored him. But something was different. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was observing. He noticed the way children skipped past without judgment, the way the baker always hummed when carrying warm bread, the way sunlight touched the stone steps like a soft cloth. These were details he had never noticed while begging. He had been too busy hoping, grasping, needing. As the sun began to lower, he felt hunger in his belly, but he also felt space in his chest. Not the emptiness of lack, but the opening of awareness. He was not just a beggar, he was a witness. And in that witnessing, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. The monk returned that evening and asked, "How was your day?" The beggar looked at him, surprised by his own answer. "I didn't beg," he said, "and yet I received something." "What did you receive?" the monk asked. "A quiet mind," he whispered, "and a full heart." The monk nodded, eyes kind. "You see, begging is not just of the hand. Many beg with their thoughts, their worries, their fears, always asking life to be different, always pleading for things to be fixed. But when we stop begging, we start seeing. And in seeing, we begin to remember we already have what we truly need." From that day forward, the beggar continued to sit by the temple gate. But he no longer asked for anything. People still gave him food sometimes. Others gave him nothing. But he remained content. He had forgotten how to beg, not because he had given up, but because he had remembered how to be. In time, villagers began to say he looked more like a sage than a beggar. Children sat near him in silence. Travelers sought his quiet company. And when they asked him for wisdom, he would smile and say, "Once I begged for life to change. Then I stopped asking, and it changed me instead." The Buddha taught that grasping is the root of suffering. And yet, letting go is not always an action. Sometimes it's simply the absence of reaching, the absence of needing the world to give us something more than this moment. And so, the beggar who forgot to beg became the one who taught others to stop asking and start seeing, not with the eyes, but with the soul that waits quietly beneath all wanting. The mirror that reflected only stillness. In an old monastery built high into the mountains, tucked behind stone walls and shaded by ancient pines, there was a single object that no one truly understood. A round, silver mirror placed at the center of the meditation hall. It hung from a wooden frame with no ornament, no carvings, no markings at all. But what made it special was whispered from monk to monk. It reflected only stillness. If a person walked in full of worry, their face would appear faint and dull in its surface. If they were angry, it showed only clouds. If they were restless, the glass shimmered like rippling water. But when a monk sat in complete calm, when the mind was quiet, the breath slow, and the heart at peace, the mirror finally cleared, and the reflection became vivid and bright, as if the person were glowing from within. Many monks spent years trying to master the mirror, They sat before it, stiff with effort. They clenched their jaws, held their breath, begged their thoughts to stop. But the mirror remained blank, fogged or dim. Some grew frustrated, some gave up. But a few began to understand that the mirror was not broken, it was honest. One day, a young novice named Anu arrived. He had heard of the mirror and, like many before him, was eager to prove his worth. On the first morning, he sat before it, spine straight, eyes focused, thoughts racing beneath the surface. He tried to breathe evenly. He repeated mantras in his mind, but the mirror gave him only a dull grey blur. Day after day he returned. But the more he tried, the more the mirror refused to reflect him. He felt ashamed. "Why is everyone else able to see their stillness?" he asked a senior monk. The old man simply laughed. "Everyone? No, most just pretend. But the mirror cannot be fooled. It shows what is really there." Anu stopped trying so hard after that. He began to sit without performance. He let his mind wander. He didn't force silence. He just watched. And slowly, he began to notice things he had never seen before, the way his breath moved through his chest, the sound of birds outside the hall, the gentle creaking of the wooden floor beneath him. He didn't push the noise away. He just stopped fighting it. Then one afternoon, without thinking, he glanced at the mirror. And there he was, clearly, calmly, reflected back, not as perfect, but as whole. Not as someone who had achieved stillness, but as someone who had stopped resisting the present moment. His eyes weren't stern, his shoulders weren't rigid. He simply was. The Buddha once taught, "Peace comes when we cease to disturb it." And in that moment, Anu understood that the mirror had never been a test. It was a teacher. It didn't reward silence. It revealed it. It didn't punish distraction. It displayed it. It showed each person what they carried inside, without judgment, without distortion. And when the noise inside a person faded, even for a breath, the mirror responded, not with applause, but with reflection. The mirror that reflected. Only stillness reminds us that we do not need to chase peace. We need to clear the space where it already lives. Stillness isn't something we force into being. It is uncovered, beneath thoughts, beneath striving, beneath the ego's need to appear composed. And when we sit quietly enough to no longer need the mirror's approval, that's when it finally shows us the truth. Not just how we look, but who we are when we are no longer trying to be anything at all. The child who drew the Buddha in the dust. In a dry village where rain hadn't fallen in many months, the earth had cracked open into lines like old hands. The wells were low, the crops tired, and the people even more so. Worry hung in the air like dust, clinging to skin and thought alike. Life was small, survival loud. But in the center of the village, near the empty fountain, there lived a quiet child named Suri. She spoke little, not because she was shy, but because she listened. She listened to the sound of dry wind, to the silence between the footsteps of tired workers, to the space between the crows' calls. And most of all, she listened to the dust, how it moved when the wind passed, how it covered everything yet revealed anything if brushed just right. One afternoon, while the adults argued about the failing harvest and how to pray for rain, Suri knelt beside the fountain with a stick in her hand and began to draw. Slowly, gently, as if touching something sacred. She didn't sketch flowers or animals like the other children sometimes did. She began drawing a face. A calm face with closed eyes and a soft smile. A face that looked like stillness itself. A face she had seen once in a faded painting inside the village temple. The Buddha. She wasn't copying. She was remembering. As she drew, her breath slowed. The village noise faded, and though the sun burned above her, she felt cool inside. With every stroke, her hand stopped trembling. Her worries stopped whispering, and something inside her that had felt too young to name finally settled, like dust falling after the wind. A monk who had come from the mountains to help the villagers noticed her from a distance. At first, he thought she was just playing, but as he walked closer, he stopped. What he saw wasn't just a drawing, it was a prayer, not one spoken, but one felt, pure, quiet, present. He knelt beside her and said, "You know his face." Suri didn't look up. She just whispered, "I've never seen it in the mirror, but I feel like it's my own." The monk's heart softened. "You've remembered something most adults forget, that the Buddha lives not in statues, but in stillness, and you have found that stillness in dust." Soon, others from the village gathered around. They didn't speak at first, just looked. Something about the face she had drawn made them fall silent, not out of awe, but out of return, as if something familiar had finally been uncovered after being buried for years. The drawing wasn't perfect, the lines were uneven, the dust shifted beneath her hand. But none of that mattered, because it wasn't the image that calmed them, it was the presence behind it. When a gust of wind came and swept the drawing away, someone gasped. But Suri smiled. "He's still here," she said. "I just don't need to see him now." The Buddha once said, "What you think, you become. What you feel, you attract. What you imagine, you create." But what Suri showed that day was something even more subtle. That peace can be drawn not with ink, not with color, but with presence alone. That a child, sitting quietly in the dirt, can teach a whole village how to return to the moment. The village didn't get rain that day. The crops didn't suddenly bloom. But something did shift. Arguments quieted. Smiles appeared where frowns had lived. And that night, the wind that passed through the village felt softer, as if even it had been calmed by the image drawn not just in the dust, but in the hearts of those who saw. And so, the child who drew the Buddha wasn't remembered for her art. She was remembered for her stillness, for reminding a weary village that even in a dry, broken land, peace could bloom quietly, in the hands of a child who knew how to listen. The candle that refused to burn out. In a forgotten temple nestled at the edge of a desert where sandstorms howled like wounded animals and stars looked down in eternal silence, there was a single candle that never burned out. Monks who lived there long ago called it the eternal light. It wasn't large, it wasn't ornate. It stood in a plain clay holder atop a stone altar worn smooth by time. And though the wind rattled the temple's windows and years passed like grains of sand, the candle's flame never flickered. Travelers who stumbled upon the temple didn't believe the story until they saw it with their own eyes. A flame, steady and golden, dancing slowly in the stillness. Many tried to explain it. Some called it a miracle. Others believed it was a trick, a hidden source of fuel. But one monk knew better. He said, "This flame does not survive because of oil or wax. It survives because no one is trying to control it. The monk's name was Mahinda. He had lived in the temple since youth and had watched countless seekers come and go. Some tried to shield the flame from imagined danger, cupping it with their hands. It flared and nearly died. Others tried to analyze it, to measure it, to understand its shape, and it grew dim. But when left alone, untouched, unstudied, it burned strong, quiet, alive. Mahinda would often sit before the candle for hours, saying nothing, doing nothing, just watching. "The mind," he whispered once to a novice, "is like this flame. The more you meddle with it, the weaker it becomes. But when you give it space, it reveals its nature, steady, warm, eternal." One day, a young woman arrived at the temple. She was not a monk nor a scholar. Her eyes were tired, not from travel, but from years of inner storms. She had tried every method to find peace: mantras, teachings, control. But her heart remained unsettled. When she saw the candle, she sat down, expecting answers. Hours passed. Nothing happened. She became frustrated. "What does this flame teach?" she asked aloud. The monk smiled. "Have you tried listening to it?" She frowned. "How do you listen to something that doesn't speak?" "You stop speaking," he replied. So she did. She stopped demanding meaning. She stopped looking for transformation. She simply watched the flame, breath by breath. And slowly, her own breath softened. Her shoulders fell. Her heartbeat slowed. She stopped needing the candle to explain anything, and that's when she began to understand. The flame wasn't burning for her. It wasn't waiting to be discovered or praised. It burned because it was its nature to burn. It needed no reason, no reward, no audience. The Buddha once said, "Be a lamp unto yourself." And in that silent moment, the candle became a mirror. She saw her own striving reflected in its stillness, her need to fix, to control, to achieve. But also, she saw the part of her that had always been quietly burning, beneath the noise, beneath the stories, the part that asked for nothing and just was. The candle that refused to burn out teaches something that can't be taught through words alone, that the deepest light within us does not come from struggle or explanation. It comes from stillness. It does not need to be lit. It only needs to be left alone long enough to remember its own glow. And in a world that demands more, louder, faster, this story reminds us that endurance is not always strength. Sometimes it is gentleness. Sometimes it is the choice to remain lit, without proving, without shrinking, without extinguishing ourselves for approval. That kind of flame cannot be broken, because it never burns for attention. It burns for truth. The tea that was made from silence. High in the hills of a forgotten province, where the clouds hung low and the mornings carried the scent of pine, there lived a solitary monk named Ray. He was not famous. No pilgrims sought him out. No scriptures bore his name. Yet those who accidentally stumbled upon his small hut returned changed, not from conversation, but from a cup of tea. They called it the tea made from silence, not because it contained rare herbs or secret ingredients. It was, in fact, the simplest brew. No sugar, no spices, just boiled water, a few green leaves, and a stillness so deep it tasted like peace. Rai never spoke while preparing it. He would quietly boil water over a wood fire, rinse the cups with care, and steep the leaves with such attention that even the birds seemed to hush in respect. Guests would sit on the wooden floor, uncertain at first, trying to fill the silence with polite smiles or nods. But the monk offered no talk, only presence, only tea. And then something would happen, something so gentle it could be missed. The world inside the guest would begin to quiet. Thoughts would slow, breathing would deepen. The hot tea, taken in silence, would somehow stir something long forgotten, a calm not created but uncovered. One day, a young traveler found Ray's hut while lost on a trail. Covered in dust and full of words, he knocked loudly and asked for help. Ray opened the door with a bow, said nothing, and pointed to a mat by the fire. The traveler wanted to explain himself, how far he'd walked, what his plans were, what he was seeking. But the monk only smiled gently and began to prepare tea. The silence made the traveler nervous at first. He cleared his throat, tapped his fingers, looked around, waiting for conversation, but none came. Ray poured the tea slowly, handed him the cup, and sat across from him without a single word. The first sip was just that, tea, bitter, hot. But the second, something shifted. The warmth filled not just his mouth, but his chest. His muscles softened, his shoulders dropped. The fire crackled gently. Outside, a breeze passed through the trees like a whispered lullaby. No questions, no answers, just presence. And in that moment, the traveler realized this silence was not empty. It was full of awareness, of peace, of a kind of listening deeper than any conversation he had ever had. The Buddha once said, "Silence is an empty space. Space is the home of the awakened mind." Ray had never read that line aloud. He lived it. His tea wasn't special because of what it contained. It was special because of how it was given, with complete presence, with no effort to impress, and no need to speak. When the cup was empty, Ray bowed. The traveler bowed back. Still no words. He left the hut that day feeling lighter, as if something inside him had been poured out and replaced with quiet. Not silence that isolates, but silence that connects. Years later, he would speak of that moment, not as a lesson in tea, but in truth. "He taught me that not everything needs to be said," the traveler told others, "and that sometimes the deepest healing doesn't come from answers, but from the space where no answers are needed." The tea that was made from silence reminds us that not all wisdom arrives in words. Sometimes it arrives in warmth, in still hands, in the quiet between sips. And in that space, we don't learn something new. We remember something ancient, that peace is always one breath, one pause, one silent cup away. The dog that bowed to a bodhisattva. In a dusty village where the roads were cracked and the homes were built from dried mud and kindness, there lived a stray dog no one claimed. His fur was patchy, his ears bent from old fights, and his body thin from years of scavenging. He did not bark at strangers or beg at doorsteps. He simply wandered, quiet, watchful, alone. But what made the villagers whisper about him was not his sadness. It was his stillness. Every morning at sunrise, the dog walked to the small stone shrine at the edge of town. Inside the shrine stood a statue of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, carved from river stone, hands folded in blessing, eyes half closed in eternal kindness. The dog would sit before this statue, not for food, not for shelter, just to be there. Then, slowly, with no command, he would lower his body in a deep bow, forehead nearly touching the earth. He would stay like that, breathing slowly until the sun lifted past the trees. Then he would rise, turn, and leave, fading back into the dirt streets. Children watched him. Elders spoke of omens. Some believed he was the reincarnation of a monk. Others believed he had once been saved by kindness and never forgot it. But none dared disturb his ritual. It felt too sacred. One day, a traveling monk arrived. Worn robes, staff in hand, he walked with a grace that came from having lost everything unnecessary. When he heard the villager's story, he rose before dawn and waited by the shrine. Sure enough, as the first light touched the horizon, the dog arrived. The monk said nothing. He simply watched. The dog approached the statue, eyes soft, steps quiet. And then he bowed, slowly, completely, as if remembering something older than pain. The monk felt his chest tighten. Tears rose without warning, not from sorrow, but from recognition. After the dog left, the monk remained in silence. Then he whispered to the bodhisattva, "What did you show him that we have forgotten?" That evening, the monk shared with the villagers. This dog does not bow because he understands teachings. He bows because he feels presence. In a world that hurt him, ignored him, and gave him nothing, he found something that asked for nothing in return and offered only stillness. And so he bows, not in fear, not in duty, but in peace. The Buddha once said, "Even the smallest being, when touched by true compassion, remembers the way home." The dog had found that home, not in shelter, but in sacred presence. Not in food, but in stillness. In a world where he had no name, no master, no safety, he had discovered the one place that held him without asking him to be more than what he was. The dog that bowed to a bodhisattva teaches us that reverence does not belong only to the wise, the educated, or the holy. Sometimes it lives in the humble, in the quiet, in those who carry pain without bitterness. It reminds us that devotion does not require words, only presence, that even a broken body can carry a remembering soul. And maybe, just maybe, the ones we overlook, the stray, the wounded, the silent, are not lost at all. Perhaps they are the ones who still know how to bow. The spider that taught a monk to let go. In a quiet forest cloaked with morning mist, a young monk named Jaya wandered alone. His master had sent him there not to seek enlightenment, but to learn what could not be taught in words. Jaya carried no books, no tools, only a small satchel and a heart full of thoughts that clung like thorns. Regrets from his past, expectations about the future, the pressure to be a good monk. Though his robes were simple, his mind was heavy. Each morning he sat beneath a great tree to meditate, but his mind was never still. The past replayed like a broken song. The future stretched before him like a storm. One day, after yet another restless sit, he opened his eyes and noticed something above him, a spider slowly weaving its web between two thin branches. Nothing unusual at first, but something about the way it moved, slow, sure, silent, held his attention. Every thread it released, it did without fear. It didn't pause to worry if the wind would tear it down. It didn't check if the branch would hold. It simply moved, one leg at a time, line by line, letting go, stretching, landing, beginning again. Jaya watched for hours, mesmerized. This tiny creature, no books, no vows, no teacher, seemed freer than he was. It did not overthink. It did not hold back. It spun what it could, then trusted the rest. But the next morning, when he returned to the same tree, the web was broken. Torn by wind, perhaps, or rain. Only a few strands clung to the bark like old threads of memory, and yet the spider was already rebuilding, not mourning, not frozen, not trying to recover the exact pattern it had before. It simply began again, from where it was. Something broke open inside the monk. He realized he had been living like a spider, clinging to old webbing, trying to fix the past, rebuild what was already gone, hold things that were meant to be released. All the while, life moved on. The wind blew. Time passed. And like the spider, he too was meant to let go and begin again, not with regret, but with trust. The Buddha once said, "You only lose what you cling to." And Jaya understood now that letting go was not a loss. It was a return to the present, to breath, to the quiet act of creating something new, even if it might break again. From that day on, the spider became his teacher. Each morning, he returned to watch it spin. Some days it succeeded, some days it failed. But it never hesitated to begin, and neither did he. When his mind wandered, he noticed it with kindness. When old fears returned, he didn't fight them. He simply watched them pass, like wind through trees. He stopped trying to be a perfect monk. He started being a present one. And slowly, without force, the knots in his chest began to loosen. The spider that taught a monk to let go is a lesson not of grand awakenings, but of gentle release, of how healing doesn't always come through force, but through the quiet willingness to trust life again. To build, not because it will last, but because building is living. And like the spider, we don't need to hold on so tightly. We just need to begin again, softly, patiently, one breath, one thread, one step at a time. And the stranger who knew the temple bell's name. In a remote village nestled between quiet mountains, there stood a small Buddhist temple where the days passed slowly and the wind moved like prayer. The temple itself was simple: wooden beams, a stone floor, and a large bronze bell that hung just above the entrance, untouched except during ceremonies. It was said that this bell had no carvings, no markings, and no history, just a pure, deep sound that could be heard across the valley whenever it rang. But the monks believed something peculiar, that the bell had a name, one known only to those who truly understood it. Over time, they had given up trying to find it. The abbots had written poems about it. The novices had meditated beside it, but none had discovered what the bell wanted to be called. Still, they kept it polished and bowed before it each morning, not to claim knowledge, but to honor mystery. But one morning, as winter began to thin and the wind carried the scent of thawing earth, a stranger arrived. He wore no robes, carried no scrolls, and looked like a common traveler: dusty feet, a plain satchel, and quiet eyes. He bowed at the gate and asked to sit in the courtyard. The head monk agreed, as was their custom. The stranger sat there for hours, saying nothing, just listening, not speaking to the monks, not asking about the scriptures, not requesting food, just watching the bell. At sunset, he finally stood, walked gently to the base of the bell, and whispered a single word, not loudly, not dramatically, just soft and clear. Then he bowed. The bell rang, not from being struck, not from wind. It simply rang. A low, resonant tone that rolled through the valley like water over stone. The monks rushed out in awe. Some thought it was an illusion, others believed it was the sound of the mountain responding, but the stranger said nothing. He just smiled, bowed once more, and walked away before the stars appeared. That night, the monks sat in silence. The bell remained still, but the sound echoed in their hearts. The head monk asked softly, "What was the name he spoke?" But none had heard it clearly. It wasn't a word they knew, and yet they felt it, not in their minds, but in their bones. The Buddha once said, "The truth has no name, yet when it is spoken, everything recognizes it." In the days that followed, the monks noticed something had shifted. The bell looked the same, but when they stood near it, their breath slowed. Their thoughts softened. The courtyard felt fuller, though nothing had changed. They realized the name was not meant to be remembered. It was meant to awaken something inside them. The stranger who knew the temple bell's name teaches us that some truths cannot be explained or captured in words. Some wisdoms are not learned, they are felt. There are names that belong not to language, but to recognition, to presence, to harmony so complete it needs no introduction. And perhaps what the stranger spoke wasn't a name at all, but a moment of absolute stillness, a meeting between him and the bell where nothing was missing, and so the bell responded, not to sound, but to understanding. Sometimes the deepest connection is not about knowing what something is called, but about knowing what it is. The monk who slept through enlightenment. In a quiet monastery tucked between two rivers, where lotus flowers opened each morning like silent bells, there lived a young monk named Arun. He was known not for his discipline nor his wisdom, but for something else entirely, his sleep. No matter the hour, no matter the teaching, Arun could be found dozing somewhere, beneath the Bodhi tree, in the corner of the library, sometimes even mid-meditation, his head gently swaying before settling on his chest. The other monks shook their heads. "He is wasting his chance," they whispered. "While we rise before the sun, while we fast, chant, and sit for hours in silence, he sleeps." Some teased him, others avoided him, and Arun, half embarrassed, half content, simply smiled and bowed. "I do not sleep to escape," he once said softly. "I sleep because I cannot fight what my body asks." One day, the monastery buzzed with anticipation. A great teacher from the northern mountains had arrived. It was said he had attained deep insight, so deep even the most restless minds found peace in his presence. All the monks gathered in the courtyard. They prepared their robes, straightened their postures, and waited in silence for the master's teaching. Arun, of course, arrived late. He sat in the very back, beneath a fig tree, leaning gently against its trunk. As the teacher began to speak, the words flowed like honey over the crowd, gentle truths about suffering, about attachment, about the illusion of control. But Arun, tired from a morning of chores and a belly full of rice, slowly drifted into sleep. And as he slept, something happened, something no one expected. He did not dream, he did not move. But deep within that quiet, unresisting space, something in him loosened. Something he had clung to without knowing. His idea of being behind, of being wrong, of not being enough like the others, slipped away. There was no effort, no striving, just stillness. The Buddha once said, "When the mind is calm, even sleep becomes a gate." Arun didn't hear these words, but his being received them. As the teaching ended, the monks stood and bowed. The master smiled and looked over the group, his gaze eventually landing on the sleeping monk beneath the tree. He raised his hand and said, "Leave him. He has understood what words cannot reach." Gasps rippled through the courtyard. Some monks were confused. Others looked at Arun with new eyes. The master explained, "You listen with effort. He listens with surrender. And sometimes truth enters not through the ears, but through the space where resistance is gone." When Arun finally woke, the sun had shifted. The courtyard was empty. But something inside him felt different, lighter, like a heavy robe had been removed from his shoulders. He didn't know he had changed. He only knew that for the first time in a long while, he no longer felt behind. He no longer felt like he needed to catch up. He simply walked forward, aware, awake, and completely present. He returned to the same routines, sweeping the courtyard, fetching water, sitting quietly beneath trees. But his presence had shifted. Other monks began to sit near him, not to speak, but to share in the peace that surrounded him. It was not flashy, it was not loud, but it was unmistakable. The monk who slept through enlightenment reminds us that awakening does not always come in the form we expect. It does not always arrive through effort, sweat, or struggle. Sometimes it enters when we are most surrendered, when we stop trying to grasp and simply let go. We are taught to chase peace, to earn rest. But what if peace arrives the moment we stop fighting for it? What if, like Arun, we find the deepest truths not in doing more, but in resisting less? Not every moment of stillness is laziness. Sometimes it is the soul's way of saying, "This is where the door opens. Quiet now, let it in." The stone that refused to be moved. In a quiet clearing between two hills, where wild grasses danced and dragonflies stitched the air, there lay a stone that had not moved in over 100 years. It wasn't large, but it was firm, rounded at the edges, warm from the sun, and settled into the earth as if it belonged there more than anything else. Travelers passed it often. Children climbed over it. Monks from a nearby monastery sometimes rested on it between long walks. But no one could recall a time when it had ever shifted, even during storms, floods, or earthquakes. It became known as the stone that refused to be moved. Some said it had been placed there by an enlightened being. Others believed it had a spirit of its own, but most simply accepted it as part of the landscape, a quiet companion to time. One summer, a young monk named Rahula came to the monastery seeking peace. His thoughts were loud, his heart heavy, and his sleep troubled. No matter how hard he meditated, the chatter in his mind would not stop. His teacher noticed this restlessness and told him, "Go sit by the stone. Don't ask it for answers. Just be with it." So Rahula went. At first, He was impatient. He sat beside the stone but kept checking the sky, the trees, the ants on the ground. His legs ached, his back itched, his thoughts wandered. But the stone did not react. It did not change. It remained still. He returned the next day, and the day after, and slowly something began to shift, not in the stone, but in him. The stone did not try to teach. It did not try to soothe. It did not say, "You must quiet your mind." It simply was, present, rooted, unmoved. And by being what it was, it revealed something Rahula had never truly seen, the power of grounded stillness. One afternoon, while sitting beside it, Rahula's thoughts began to race again. Old fears, doubts, longings, the kind that make the heart flutter and the chest tighten. But this time, he didn't run from them. He didn't try to push them away. He just watched, like the stone. And as he watched, the thoughts passed. Not with drama, not with resolution. They simply faded, like clouds moving across a sky that never tries to hold them. The Buddha once said, "Be firm as a solid rock, unshaken by criticism or praise." Rahula remembered these words and finally understood their meaning. It was not about being hard or cold. It was about resting so deeply in presence that nothing could pull you out of it. Not fear, not hope, not even joy. In time, Rahula became known as one of the calmest monks in the monastery. Not because he forced silence into himself, but because he learned from the stone how to allow everything without being moved by anything. The stone that refused to be moved teaches a quiet truth. Peace is not the absence of movement in the world. It is the absence of being dragged by every wave inside it. Stillness is not passivity. It is presence without resistance. It is the courage to remain steady when the winds of emotion, doubt, and change try to uproot the self. And sometimes the greatest teacher is not one who speaks, but one who simply stays, without effort, without need, without fear. Just there, like a stone in a clearing, showing that what cannot be moved is not what resists the world, but what is so deeply part of it, it no longer fears where it stands. The breath that healed 1,000 sorrows. In a village that had known too many winters, where grief lingered in doorways and silence filled the streets, there lived a healer. Not a doctor, not a sage, just an old woman named Laya, who swept the temple floors and offered tea to strangers. No one knew much about her past, but everyone whispered the same thing: she listens in a way that makes sorrow disappear. People came to her not for advice, but just to sit. They didn't know why, but something about her presence softened their pain. She didn't speak much. Sometimes she didn't speak at all. She would just sit across from them, hands in her lap, eyes closed, breathing, slow, quiet, steady. And as they watched her, they too began to breathe differently. Less like gasps, more like prayers. One day, a young monk came to the village. He had lost his brother in the war, his teacher, his sense of peace. The chants no longer worked. His meditations collapsed into tears. He had memorized sutras, recited precepts, even fasted for days. But the ache in his chest remained, tight, sharp, alive. He was drowning in it. Someone told him about Laya. Skeptical, he arrived at the temple and found her sweeping the steps. She looked at him once, then nodded toward the shaded platform beneath the Bodhi tree. He sat. She sat. No words. He waited for a lesson, for wisdom, for anything, but all she did was breathe. In, out, soft and deep, as if nothing in the world needed to be fixed, as if nothing in the world was wrong. Minutes passed, then an hour, and something strange began to happen. His chest, always so tight with sorrow, began to loosen, not because she gave him answers, but because she wasn't asking him to fix it. She wasn't trying to rescue him from it. She just breathed, as if to say, pain belongs here too. He closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he didn't fight the sadness. He didn't push it away. He let it sit beside him, like an old companion who had been waiting to be acknowledged. And he breathed, not to control, not to heal, just to feel. The Buddha once said, "As the breath flows in and out, so too do joy and sorrow. Let them pass and return always to the breath." In that moment, the monk understood. His sorrow wasn't a problem to solve. It was a wave that only became dangerous when he tried to hold it back. He began to breathe with Laya, not in sync, not by design, but by grace. The air moved through him, and with it the weight began to lift, not all at once, but gently. Like mist rising from wet earth after rain, he came back each day, sat in silence, and day by day the breath took root, not just in his lungs, but in his heart. He returned to the monastery not with solutions, but with softness. When others cried, he didn't rush to comfort. He just sat, breathed, held the space that Leia had once held for him. Word of this quiet monk began to spread. People said he had no answers, but that somehow, sitting with him, made everything hurt less. The breath that healed. 1,000 Sorrows teaches us that healing doesn't always roar. It doesn't always come through understanding or speech. Sometimes it comes through presence, through sitting with pain, not to erase it, but to breathe through it. We forget that the breath is the one thing that has stayed with us through every sorrow, every joy, every moment of fear. It doesn't argue, it doesn't judge, it just continues, gentle, loyal, quietly offering to carry us through whatever comes. And sometimes that's all we need, to remember that the breath is still here, that we are still here, and that no matter how heavy sorrow becomes, it can always be softened, one breath at a time. The Master who gave answers without speaking. In the mountains, where the air was thin and the pine trees whispered like old monks, there lived a teacher who never spoke. His name was not written, his words never recorded, and yet seekers from distant lands climbed the steep paths to find him. Not because he gave lectures or teachings, but because they said something in his silence, answered questions more clearly than any voice ever could. He lived in a hut the size of a breath, no scrolls, no altar, just a cushion, a small bowl, and the sound of wind passing through wooden slats. When visitors arrived, he would simply open the door, gesture toward the floor, and sit with them. That was all. No rituals, no mantras, no advice. Some people stayed 5 minutes. Some stayed 5 days. And many, though they came full of questions about life, about love, about suffering, left with tears on their cheeks and peace in their chest. though not a single word had been exchanged. One day, a young man arrived, angry, confused, his heart full of noise. He had studied under many teachers and filled notebooks with teachings, but still he felt lost. If I could only get the right answer, he thought, maybe the storm inside me would stop. He climbed for 3 days to reach the silent master. When he arrived, he bowed and immediately began speaking. I don't understand why I feel this way. I've meditated, fasted, chanted. I've read all the suttas. But still, I feel hollow. I can't forgive someone who hurt me. I want to be free, but I can't let go. What should I do? Tell me, please, what is the way? The master didn't blink, didn't nod, didn't react. He simply gestured toward the floor. The young man sat, heart pounding, eyes tight with frustration. Silence filled the room like a weight. Minutes passed, then an hour, then another. At first, the silence screamed. His mind raced. Why won't he speak? Is he mocking me? Doesn't he care? But the master just sat, present, soft, still. And the longer they sat, the more something inside the young man began to shift. The silence didn't judge, it didn't instruct, it simply held. And soon his anger began to rise, not at the master, but at himself. Then his sadness, then shame, then exhaustion. And when there was nothing left but breath, something opened, something tender and quiet. He began to cry. The master didn't move, but in that stillness, the young man felt everything he had been running from, the ache, the tightness, the need to be seen, forgiven, whole. And he realized he had never needed an answer. He had needed space, safe, undisturbed space to hear what was already inside him. The Buddha once said, "The answer is not found in more thoughts, but in the silence that holds them all." When the young man finally stood to leave, he bowed again, this time not in search, but in gratitude. He had been heard, not by words, but by presence. The master who gave answers, without speaking, reminds us that wisdom is not always taught, it is uncovered. Not all pain needs to be fixed. Not every question needs to be solved. Some things simply need to be witnessed, gently, patiently, without interruption. And sometimes the most powerful teacher is not the one who speaks loudest, but the one who sits with you, silently reflecting your storm until it settles into still water, where the answer, all along, has been waiting in the quiet. The cloud that learned to stay. Far above the tallest peaks, where the sky felt like a vast ocean of blue, there once drifted a single, restless cloud. It had no name, no shape it kept for long, and no place it called home. It moved constantly, chased by winds, pulled by currents, always in motion. When the sun rose, it rushed to hide. When storms gathered, it raced ahead. It feared stillness. It feared being seen. Below, nestled in a valley of quiet rice fields and slow, swaying trees, a small temple stood, its roof worn with time and rain. The monks there lived simply, sweeping leaves, offering alms, chanting with soft voices. Among them was an elderly monk who each morning would sit in the courtyard and look up, not to watch birds, not to admire the stars, but to wait for the cloud. He saw it every few days, hovering, barely stopping. He would smile and whisper to the sky, "Stay, even just for a moment." It's okay to rest. But the cloud always passed. One morning, the cloud lingered longer than usual. Maybe the wind was tired. Maybe the world below finally looked soft enough to trust. Whatever the reason, it slowed. The old monk looked up and whispered again, "You don't have to go. Even clouds are allowed to rest." The cloud hovered, unsure. What would happen if it stayed? Would it become heavy, filled with rain? Would it disappoint the sky? And yet, it didn't move. It drifted above the temple for hours, changing shape, softening, allowing itself to be instead of becoming. Something shifted. It noticed the warmth of the sun, not something to flee from, but something that gently touched its edges. It noticed the reflection of its body in the temple's still pond, how even its softness had presence, how even its stillness created beauty. For the first time, the cloud realized that staying didn't mean being stuck. It meant being seen. The Buddha once said, "You, yourself, as much as anyone in the universe, deserve your love and affection." And staying, truly staying, requires exactly that. The courage to stop running, to stop changing long enough to say, "This is who I am today, and that is enough." The cloud wept, not loudly, not in grief, but in release. Gentle rain fell over the temple, softening the dust, refreshing the air. The monks didn't rush for cover. They smiled, letting it wash over their shoulders and robes, and the cloud stayed. It hovered through the day, through dusk, and into the night, glowing silver in the moonlight. It wasn't trying to be beautiful. It wasn't trying to matter. But because it stayed, it was both. Over time, the cloud moved on, but it no longer raced the wind. It no longer changed shape to please the sky. It floated with ease, knowing that rest wasn't weakness, that pausing wasn't failure. It carried the stillness it had found above the temple in its heart, if a cloud could have one. The cloud that learned to stay teaches us something many forget in a world of motion, that we are not made only to move, to chase, to become. We are also meant to be, to settle, to let the light touch us, to let ourselves be seen without shifting into what we think others want to witness. Sometimes staying in one place, one breath, one feeling, one truth is the bravest thing we can do. And like that cloud, we may just find that when we stop trying to prove we belong, we finally feel it. The bowl that was always full. At the edge of a dense forest where orchids bloomed even in the dry season and the rivers sang louder than the birds, there was a small monastery known for one quiet miracle. It was not grand or wealthy. The monks wore patched robes and walked barefoot on warm stones, but at the center of their dining hall, placed on a wooden stand, sat a simple clay bowl that was always full. Not of gold, not of treasure, but of food, fresh rice, steamed greens, lentil stew, fruit that glistened like sunlight. The strange thing was, no one ever saw anyone fill it. The monks never cooked more than what they needed. No donors brought excess. Yet whenever someone was hungry, traveler, orphan, stranger, the bowl was enough. Not overflowing, not magical, just enough. The villagers called it the compassion bowl, and though many came to see it, only a few understood it. One day, a skeptical scholar from a far city arrived. His robes were sharp, his questions sharper. "Show me how this bowl works," he demanded. "There must be a trick." The abbot, a soft-spoken monk with eyes like calm water, said gently, "The bowl fills only when it is approached without greed." The scholar scoffed. "Nonsense, bowls don't read intentions." Still, he sat to observe. All morning, monks passed by the bowl. One placed a few berries in it. Another poured a ladle of soup. A third dropped in 3 pieces of bread and bowed. By midday, the bowl had enough food for all who came, and yet no one looked poorer for giving. That evening, the scholar tried an experiment. When no one watched, he placed a full handful of fruit into the bowl, but not with kindness, with pride. "Let's see how full you are now," he whispered. But when he returned later, the fruit was gone, and the bowl looked the same as before. He confronted the abbot again. "Why doesn't it keep what I gave?" The abbot smiled. "Because giving with ego is the same as not giving at all." The Buddha once said, "A generous heart, even with little to give, fills the world." The bowl did not measure quantity. It responded to intention. It was not a vessel of miracles. It was a reflection of those around it. A novice monk once explained it best. The bowl is not always full with food. It is always full with enough. Enough to feed one more. Enough to remind someone they are seen. Enough to prove that emptiness, when held with kindness, becomes a space for grace to arrive. One winter, a famine hit the valley. Crops failed, storage pots emptied. Fear crept into the hearts of even the monks. They had little left. Just small scoops of rice, a few dried roots. But every morning, without fail, the monks walked to the bowl and placed something inside, whatever little they could spare, and still the hungry were fed. Not because the bowl was magic, but because generosity, when shared without calculation, multiplies. The bowl taught them to trust, not in wealth, but in compassion, and in trusting each other, they became rich beyond measure. The bowl that was always full reminds us that abundance is not about excess. It is about sufficiency wrapped in sincerity. It shows that the heart, when opened even slightly, becomes a vessel that gives without fear of running dry. Because what truly fills the bowl is not what the hand offers, but what the spirit carries. And perhaps the reason the bowl never emptied is simple. It was never filled with food alone, but with love that expected nothing in return. The bird that sang only in silence. In the heart of an ancient forest, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight filtered through like spilled gold, there lived a bird no one had ever seen, only heard. Its song was soft, clear, and so beautiful that those who heard it often froze in place, forgetting what they were doing. But there was something strange about this bird. It only sang in silence. If the wind was loud, it stayed quiet. If the forest was full of voices, it did not make a sound. But when all grew still, when even the trees seemed to hold their breath, its song would drift like incense into the ears of those present. The villagers who lived near the edge of the forest called it the bird of silence. Many tried to find it. None succeeded. One day, a young monk named Kavi, exhausted from the endless chatter of monastery life and the noise of his own thoughts, left to find peace. "I have memorized the teachings," he said. "I have practiced the breath, but still my mind shouts inside me, I need something deeper." He heard of the bird from a woodcutter. They say its song silences sorrow, the man whispered. Kavi was intrigued, not because he needed another story, but because something in him longed to hear a truth that didn't come from words. He ventured into the forest with nothing but robes, a bowl, and a quiet wish to listen. For days he heard nothing but the usual sounds: insects clicking, branches creaking, distant animal calls. Still, he stayed. He walked slower, spoke less, sat more. But every time he became too excited, too eager, the silence shattered, and the bird stayed silent too. Then one afternoon, something changed. He stopped waiting for the song. He stopped trying. He simply sat beside a river, listening not for the bird, but to everything. The rustle of leaves, the hum of insects, the way water sounded as it slipped over stone. He began to feel not like an observer of silence, but a part of it. And then it came. A single note, pure as morning light. Then another, a melody so soft it seemed to come from the trees themselves. His breath caught, not out of surprise, but because something inside him recognized it. The bird sang not into silence, but with it. Its song didn't fill the silence. It revealed it. It showed that silence was not emptiness, but music waiting to be heard. The Buddha once said, "Silence isn't empty, it's full of answers." Kavi understood now. The bird's song wasn't a reward. It wasn't something to chase. It was a reflection of presence, a mirror of peace. He never saw the bird. He never needed to. He returned to the monastery different. Not louder, not wiser, just quieter in a way that softened those around him. When others grew overwhelmed, he didn't speak right away. He just sat, breathing gently, listening. And in that silence, many felt something shift. The bird that sang only in silence reminds us that some truths are too soft for words, too sacred for noise. That peace doesn't always announce itself. It waits patiently behind our distractions. And when we finally quiet the world, not by silencing it, but by softening ourselves, we may just hear a song that was always there, waiting for us to become still enough to truly listen. The fox who watched the sunrise in stillness. In the farthest edge of a forest untouched by time, where dew clung to the grass like tiny stars, and the wind moved softly through trees that had never been named, there lived a fox unlike any other. He was not known for cunning. He did not chase prey. He did not fight for territory. He was known for something else, something the animals never fully understood. Every morning, before even the birds began to sing, the fox would climb to the highest rock in the clearing and sit absolutely still, eyes turned east, waiting for the sun to rise. He did this not once, not twice, but every single day. Whether the sky was clear or clouded, whether the wind was biting or the air thick with summer heat, the fox sat, alone, silent, still. At first, the other animals mocked him. "What does the fox think he will catch from the sky?" The squirrels laughed. "He's wasting time while the rest of us are gathering, building, surviving," the badgers muttered. Even the wise old owl raised a brow and said, "Stillness is fine at night, but when the light comes, action must follow." But the fox never answered. He never reacted. He simply returned each dawn to his stone, tail curled neatly beside him, ears relaxed, body unmoving, as if fused with the earth itself. And when the first rays of light stretched over the trees, touching his fur with gold, he would blink once, slowly, and only then rise and walk calmly into the woods. One spring, a young monk wandered through the forest during his pilgrimage. He had left his monastery to find answers to questions that clung to his heart like shadows. Questions about restlessness, about meaning, about why his soul remained anxious even in silence. He slept on moss, drank from streams, and tried to listen to the world. But his thoughts still raced. One morning, he woke before dawn and spotted the fox sitting on the rock. Curious, he watched from a distance. He expected the fox to pounce, to sniff the air, to move. But it didn't. It just sat. The monk stayed. Day after day, he rose to watch the fox. And slowly, something in him began to shift. The first few mornings, his mind spun with distractions, stories, regrets, planning. But then he noticed. The fox wasn't doing anything special. It was just being, fully, unapologetically, present. The monk sat down on a nearby log and waited. The sun rose. The fox didn't move. Neither did he. And for the first time since his journey began, the monk felt something in his chest soften, not from understanding, but from experiencing. Stillness was not the absence of movement. It was the fullness of being. The fox did not sit to accomplish something. It sat because the moment deserved attention. The Buddha once said, "When the mind is still, the beauty of the world reveals itself without needing to be chased." The fox knew this, not from scripture, not from discipline, but from instinct. Seasons changed. The monk returned to his monastery, but he brought something back with him, not a fox's silence, but a fox's presence. He no longer rushed into the day. He no longer demanded answers from the world. He began each morning with stillness, watching the light enter the room, not to seek peace, but to meet it. The fox who watched the sunrise in stillness reminds us that there is a wisdom deeper than action, deeper than words. A knowing that comes not from chasing, but from pausing. It teaches that some truths are not spoken, they are felt in the quiet breath before dawn, in the soft light that returns without fail, and in the heart that learns, finally, to be still enough to receive it. The man who ate. Regret for breakfast. In a town nestled between two dusty hills, there lived a man who rose with the sun every morning and sat at the same wooden table, chewing slowly, quietly, on what no one else could see. He was not poor, he was not sick, but each day the first thing he swallowed was regret. Not food, not tea, just silence, and the weight of what he wished he had done differently. He had once been a soldier, then a merchant, then a husband. Each role had ended with mistakes, words he didn't say, time he didn't spend, kindness withheld when it was needed most. No one punished him, no one chased him. But his memory did, and every morning he replayed his past like a well-worn ritual, feeding himself the bitterness of "if only" and "I should have." Neighbors called him quiet, kind, distant. They didn't know that behind his eyes a storm lived, one made of missed chances and soft guilt. One morning, a young Buddhist monk was passing through the town. He knocked on the man's door, asking only for a drink of water. The man nodded, silent as usual, and poured the water without a word. But something in the monk's face, calm, grounded, present, unsettled him. "You're not from here," the man finally said. "No," the monk replied. "I walk where the heart needs walking." That night, the monk asked to stay. The man agreed. At sunrise, they sat together at the wooden table. The man reached for his usual silence. But this time the monk gently asked, "What are you eating?" The man paused. "Nothing." The monk smiled. "Then why do your eyes look full of something heavy?" The man hesitated, then spoke words he had buried for years. "I eat regret. I feed it every day so it doesn't grow hungrier, so it doesn't swallow me whole." The monk nodded slowly. "And has it stopped growing?" "No," the man admitted. "It's only gotten stronger." The monk looked at him softly. "Then maybe you are not feeding it to tame it. Maybe you are keeping it alive." The man's hands trembled slightly. "What else should I do? I cannot undo what I've done." The monk placed his hands on the table. "No, but you can stop giving it your mornings." The Buddha once said, "Each morning we are born again. What we do today is what matters most." The monk continued, "Regret is not a punishment. It is a signal, and once heard, it no longer needs to be fed. It needs to be honored, not with guilt, but with change." The man lowered his gaze. "And if I'm too late to change anything?" "You are not too late to stop hurting yourself," the monk replied gently. "Begin by giving breakfast to the present." The next morning, the man did not reach for silence. He reached for tea. He boiled the water slowly, letting the steam rise like a prayer. He sliced fruit, not because he was hungry, but because he was here. He sat with the monk again, this time with no words about the past. The regret did not vanish overnight. It still whispered. But he stopped feeding it. Instead, he began offering his mornings to something new. He visited his neighbors, repaired a broken fence, planted vegetables, and gave away the extras. He did not explain himself. He just acted, quietly, presently, fully. Over time, the villagers noticed. They no longer saw a man with heavy eyes. They saw someone here, not trapped in memory, but walking gently through today. The man who ate regret for breakfast reminds us that the past does not need to be devoured each day to be remembered. That healing is not about forgetting, but about stopping the feast of suffering. About realizing that each moment spent in what was steals life from what is. And that, even after years of silence, it is never too late to rise with the sun and offer your morning to something lighter, something alive, something true. The woman who walked backwards into peace. In a village surrounded by fields of tall rice and gently weeping willows, there lived a woman who, for reasons no one could explain, chose to walk backwards wherever she went. She wasn't old, nor was she strange in any other way. Her clothes were plain, her speech soft, her eyes kind. But from the moment she left her home in the morning to the time she returned at dusk, her steps moved in reverse, slow, careful, quiet. Children whispered and giggled. Farmers paused in their work to watch her pass. Some believed she was cursed. Others thought she was broken by sorrow. But the woman never explained. She simply walked backwards through the market, to the temple, along the riverbank. and always with the same expression on her face, calm, like someone who had let go of something heavy. One day, a young girl followed her, curious, confused. She trailed behind as the woman stepped backward through the rice fields, pausing every so often to let her foot find solid ground. After an hour, the girl couldn't take it anymore. "Why do you walk that way?" she asked. "Aren't you afraid you'll fall?" The woman stopped. She didn't turn. She didn't look. She simply said, "I've spent most of my life running forward, toward things I thought would make me happy, and in the running, I missed everything around me." The girl tilted her head. "But don't you want to know where you're going?" The woman finally turned, her eyes soft with memory. "I used to believe that peace was something ahead of me, something I had to reach. So I ran, through relationships, through jobs, through praise, through pain. But peace is behind us. It's in what we've been running from. It waits patiently in the places we never pause to honor. So I walk backward, not because I'm afraid of the future, but because I'm making peace with the past." The Buddha once taught, "No one can walk the path for you, but you can return to it at any time." The woman had returned, not to change the past, but to meet it. One breath at a time, one backward step at a time, without judgment, without hurry. Over time, others in the village began to understand. They saw how gently she moved, how she noticed things others missed. A butterfly caught in a spider's web, a cracked pot that could still hold water, a child's quiet tears. While others rushed forward through the noise of becoming, she walked backward into being. She wasn't avoiding life, she was relearning it. And something remarkable happened. The more she walked backward, the more present she became, the more still her spirit grew. And the people around her, though they still walked forward, began to slow down too. They listened more, watched more, hurt each other less. The woman who walked backwards into peace teaches us that healing doesn't always look like progress, that sometimes going back is the bravest thing we can do, not to dwell, but to forgive, not to relive, but to release, to honor the footprints we once hated, and to say, "I see you now. You brought me here." And maybe that's what peace truly is. Not a place ahead, waiting to be earned, but a presence behind us, waiting to be welcomed, quiet, patient, walking backwards, right by our side. The door that opened to emptiness. In a monastery carved into the cliffs of a high mountain range, there was a door that puzzled everyone who passed through. It wasn't locked, it wasn't hidden. It simply stood there, perfectly shaped from aged teak wood, in the center of a long, narrow corridor. The strange part, when opened, it led to nothing. No room, no stairs, no courtyard, just a space, silent, bare, infinite. Monks called it the door to nowhere, and many avoided it. It made them uneasy. Why build a door that leads to nothing? They asked. It must be a mistake. Some thought it was unfinished. Others believed it was symbolic, but no one stayed long inside the empty space. No one, except for one monk. His name was Saran, a young novice who had tried every method of practice. He chanted until his voice cracked. He meditated until his legs went numb. He copied scriptures until his fingers ached. And still, something inside him remained unsettled. He wanted to feel peace, But what he felt most was pressure. The pressure to become awakened, to understand, to arrive. One evening, after yet another day of restless striving, he wandered the halls and found himself standing in front of the strange door. The moonlight made its edges glow faintly. On impulse, he opened it. There was no one inside, just space, empty. He stepped in. No shrine, no scrolls, no incense, just stone and silence. He stood there for a while, waiting for something, a voice, a sign, a hidden teaching, but nothing came, only the soft echo of his own breath. He returned the next day, then the next, and each time the same emptiness greeted him. At first, it frustrated him. Is this a test? He wondered. A riddle? But slowly, something began to shift. He stopped waiting. He sat. He breathed. And for the first time, he stopped trying to fill the space with thought, with effort, with himself. He let the silence be, and that's when he understood. The door didn't lead to nowhere. It led to emptiness, not as a void, but as truth. A space that was full of nothing, and in that nothing held everything. The Buddha once said, "Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form." Saran had heard the words before, but now he felt them. Emptiness was not the absence of meaning. It was the absence of grasping. It was the place where things could simply be, without labels, without weight, without needing to become anything else. In that empty room, he learned more than he ever had with scriptures. He learned how much of his suffering came from his own reaching, from trying to become perfect, trying to prove something, trying to be free by doing. But freedom, he now saw, was in the letting go. He began returning daily, not to practice, not to improve, but to remember how to sit with what is, how to be without needing to be more. Other monks started noticing the change. His steps were softer, his words fewer, his presence fuller. One asked him, "What teaching are you following now?" He smiled and said, "A door that leads to nothing." The door that opened to emptiness reminds us that sometimes the most sacred space is the one we resist, the one that feels like it offers nothing. Because in that emptiness, there is no pressure to perform, no need to impress, no story to uphold. There is only breath, space, stillness. And in that stillness, we meet what we've been chasing all along. Not an answer, but a return. A return to the part of us that doesn't need anything added, the part that is already enough. The thought that became a river. In a quiet village where fog curled like silk around the trees each morning and the stars lingered long after sunrise, there lived an old scribe who once wrote something so simple no one paid it any mind. It was only a single line, barely a full sentence, scribbled in the corner of a worn notebook. "I wonder what would happen if I let go." At the time, he didn't even mean to write it. It slipped from his mind like water trickling down a hill. He closed the notebook and went on with his life. But that thought, small, unspoken, unfinished, didn't disappear. It moved. At first, it drifted through his mind when he was washing rice, feeding birds, or waking in the middle of the night. Then, it moved through the village. A woman carrying water suddenly paused and asked herself, "Why am I still holding on to something that left me years ago?" A boy, angry from a fight, stopped mid-tears and wondered, what would happen if I didn't answer back? The thought began to ripple. The old scribe didn't know it, but what he had released was no longer just a question. It was a current. And like a stream feeding the soil, it began changing things without being seen. A potter stopped rushing her orders. A teacher began ending each class with silence. A widow who had worn grief like a heavy cloak for decades stood by the river one morning and let the wind take a letter she had folded and unfolded for years. The Buddha once said, "As a man thinketh, so he becomes, and as a man lets go, so he becomes free." Months passed. The thought kept flowing. One spring the scribe, now much older, sat by the same river he had lived beside his entire life. He watched it bend around stones without resistance. He watched it carry fallen leaves without complaint. And suddenly, he remembered that small line he once wrote. "I wonder what would happen if I let go." He smiled, not because he found an answer, but because he had lived into it. He finally understood that the thought was never a command. It was an invitation. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean giving up. It meant trusting flow more than control. It meant being water instead of the dam. It meant allowing something softer than effort to carry what the heart could no longer hold on its own. And just like that, he dipped his fingers into the river and whispered, "Thank you." The villagers say the river never looked the same after that. Not brighter, not louder, but deeper, like it had heard the thought too, like it had become the very thing it was asked to teach. The thought that became a river reminds us that not all transformation begins with action. Some of it begins with a quiet shift, a question asked from the soul, not for an answer, but for freedom. One gentle wondering that touches everything it meets, and, over time, erodes even the sharpest pain into smoothness. And sometimes that's all it takes. A whisper, a letting go, a single thought released like water that turns into something vast enough to carry us all the way home. The whisper that was louder than anger. In a small village tucked between two winding rivers, there was a boy named Nilo, known for his sharp temper. He was kind-hearted, but when frustrated, his voice became thunder. He shouted when things didn't go his way. He snapped at friends, argued with elders, and carried a heat in his chest that made even birds fly away when he passed. No one knew where the anger came from, not even Nilo. He didn't like hurting others, but something inside him burned, as if his heart didn't know how to cool itself. The more he tried to explain, the more misunderstood he felt. And the louder he became, the more alone he was. One day, after a fierce outburst in the village square, Nilo was sent to a nearby monastery. "Let the monks teach you peace," the village chief said, "before your fire consumes you." The monks welcomed him without question. They did not punish him. They gave him simple tasks, sweeping floors, fetching water, lighting incense. At first, he did them angrily. He slammed buckets. He huffed while he worked, but no one reacted. They simply bowed and returned to their silence. Days passed, then weeks, and still no one raised their voice. Not even when Nilo spilled water in the meditation hall or broke the teapot with careless hands. One morning, while sweeping the temple steps, Nilo slipped and dropped the broom. Frustration rose quickly. His fists clenched. His jaw tightened. The fire was ready to erupt. But just as he opened his mouth to curse, a soft voice behind him said, "Careful." That was all, just one word, whispered. He turned and saw an elderly monk, small and thin, with eyes like still water. Nilo expected a lecture or disappointment, but the monk only bent down, picked up the broom, and handed it back with a gentle smile. Something strange happened. The heat in Nilo's chest didn't rise. It fell. The fire faded, not because it was put out, but because it was met with something softer. Not silence, not resistance, but a whisper that held more strength than any shout. The next day, Nilo followed the monk and asked, "Why didn't you scold me?" The monk looked at him and said, "Anger is a guest who shouts to be noticed, but a whisper, when spoken with love, is the one who teaches it how to leave." Nilo didn't understand at first, but over time he began to listen differently. When anger rose, he didn't speak right away. He listened for the whisper underneath it, the part of him that was hurt, scared, or simply tired. The Buddha once said, "Speak only when your words are more beautiful than silence." Nilo learned that sometimes the softest voice carries the greatest truth, not because it dominates, but because it understands. Years later, the boy who once roared with anger became known for something else. People came to him with heavy hearts, and he would speak to them not with instructions, but with quiet, thoughtful words that felt like balm. They said his voice could calm storms, that he had learned to speak beneath the fire. The whisper that was louder than anger teaches us that true strength does not always raise its voice. That power is not in the volume, but in the presence behind the words. When we whisper to anger, not with fear, but with understanding, we show it something it has never known: safety. And in that safety, even the loudest rage begins to soften, to listen, and finally, to let go. The monk who slept under falling leaves. In the golden arms of autumn, where trees whispered their farewells to the sky and the wind carried the scent of change, there was a monk who chose to sleep not in a monastery, not in a hut, but beneath a canopy of trees that shed their leaves each night like soft prayers. His name was Revata, and while others folded into beds or curled beneath roofs, he laid himself down beneath branches that never held the same shape 2 nights in a row. Villagers thought him odd. "He has no roof, no walls," they said, "no protection from wind or rain, no comfort from the chill." But the monk only smiled and said, "I do not fear what falls gently." Every evening, after his alms and his meditation, Revata would return to his patch of earth beneath the trees. As the sun dipped low, leaves would begin to drift: amber, gold, rust, and deep red. One by one, they floated down, sometimes landing in his hair, on his face, on his chest. And he did not brush them away. He let them fall. One day, a young man approached him with a blanket in hand and said, "Let me build you a shelter. You deserve better than this." Revata opened his eyes and replied softly, "This is the only shelter I trust, the one that shows me that everything eventually falls. And when it does not scream, it does not resist, it just returns." The young man sat beside him, confused but curious. "How do you sleep knowing everything around you is falling?" The monk looked up at the bare branches. Because that is the truth of life. Things fall away, plans, people, youth, control, and yet we are always trying to hold everything up. We suffer not because things change, but because we think they shouldn't. The Buddha once said, "Just as a tree sheds its leaves, so must we shed our attachments." Rivata had not chosen his sleeping place out of poverty. He had chosen it out of practice. Each night beneath those trees reminded him of impermanence, not as a sorrow, but as a softness, a natural letting go, a surrender to the rhythm of things. When the rains came, he did not curse the sky. He simply moved closer to the trunk. When the winds blew strong, he pressed deeper into the earth. And when the trees became bare, he lay beneath them still, knowing new leaves would come, just as old ones had fallen. The villagers began to notice something. The monk never looked worried, never rushed, never clung to the past or feared the future. He walked with the kind of quiet that made others fall silent too, a peace that didn't rise from having answers, but from not needing any. Eventually, more villagers began sleeping outside on cool nights, if only for a few hours, just to feel what it was like, to lie still while the world let go above them. And in the hush of falling leaves, they began to understand what Rivata had known all along, that we are not meant to hold everything forever. That release is not a loss, it is a return. That peace comes not when the world stops changing, but when we stop resisting its change. The monk who slept under falling leaves reminds us that true rest is not found in holding on, but in lying gently with what falls, in letting go of what no longer clings to us, in learning to love what comes and love it again as it leaves, like leaves in autumn, like breath, like time. And when we stop fearing what falls, we finally begin to rise, light, unburdened, and completely free. The bell that rang in dreams only. At the top of a hill, wrapped in mist and moonlight, there stood a temple with a single bell tower, tall, slender, untouched by vines or dust. But there was something strange about the bell that hung there. It never rang by day. No sound ever echoed from it at sunrise. No monk had ever pulled its rope, yet people from the valley below often said they had heard it, not while awake, but in their dreams. Old farmers, young children, travelers passing through, all spoke of the same sound, a soft, low chime that seemed to arrive in sleep like a breath across still water. Some said it calmed them. Others said it made them weep. All agreed. It didn't feel like sound. It felt like truth. The monks of the temple never confirmed or denied the stories. They simply bowed when asked and returned to their sweeping, their silence, their morning tea. But among them was a young monk named Toma, who had never heard the bell. Not in sleep, not in thought, not in dreams. And he was troubled by this. He tried everything. He meditated beside the bell tower for hours. He chanted longer than the others. He even tried sleeping with his mat beneath the tower's base, hoping the sound would enter his dreams. But night after night, nothing. No bell, no peace. Frustrated, he approached the eldest monk, whose hands trembled with age, but whose eyes held more stillness than any lake. "Why does the bell come to others, but not to me?" Toma asked. "Am I not worthy of hearing it?" The old monk smiled gently and said, "The bell does not choose who is worthy. It rings when the self stops listening for it." Toma frowned. But how can I stop listening if I want so badly to hear it? The monk reached for a cup and poured tea. When you drink, do you listen for the water in your throat, or do you simply receive it? Toma said nothing. He understood. That night, he did not try to meditate. He did not wait. He lay down like a leaf resting on still ground. He let his breath rise and fall without thought. He let the air be air, the dark be dark, and sleep took him, not with force, but with surrender. And then it came. A single, distant chime, not loud, not bright, but deep, round, full. It rang, not through his ears, but through his chest. A vibration more than a sound, like someone striking the silence inside him with kindness. He woke with tears drying on his cheeks, not from sadness, but from release. The bell had spoken, and it hadn't said anything, but it had touched everything. The Buddha once said, "What you seek is seeking you, but it does not run, it waits, quietly, until we stop chasing." The bell that rang in dreams only reminds us that some truths cannot be heard with ears. They come only when the mind no longer demands, when the heart is ready to receive without control. And perhaps the most beautiful music in life is not the song we strive to hear, but the one that rises in the spaces where striving ends, the one that enters when we are finally still enough to feel it. The old woman who taught stillness to warriors. In a mountain region where stone paths echoed with the stomp of boots and the clash of wooden practice swords, there was a village known for its warriors. For generations, men and women there had trained from childhood, perfecting combat, speed, endurance, and reaction. They learned to strike without hesitation and defend without thought. Their bodies became quick, their eyes became sharp, but their minds never rested. Among the villagers lived an old woman named Sama. She owned no weapons, bore no armor, and moved with the pace of falling leaves. Her home sat at the edge of the village, beside a crooked willow tree. No one trained with her. No one spoke her name during drills. She was too slow, too quiet, too irrelevant. Until one day, everything changed. A young warrior named Rian had risen through the ranks faster than any before him. Strong, skilled, and eager to master every form of battle, he found himself haunted not by failure, but by restlessness. Even in victory, his mind ran. At night, his hands twitched. His dreams were loud. He approached the elders and asked, "How do I silence the battlefield within me?" They looked at one another and gave the same answer they gave once every decade. "Go see the old woman by the willow." He frowned. "What can she teach me? She has no sword." They only replied, "Exactly." So he went. He knocked on her wooden door, and she answered without surprise, as if she had been waiting, as if every knock came exactly when it should. She invited him to sit. No test, no instruction, just tea. He waited for wisdom. She handed him a cup. He waited for a lesson. She watched the steam rise. Finally, impatient, he said, "I came to learn stillness." She looked into his eyes and said, "Then sit still." He laughed, thinking it was a joke. "That's all." She said nothing. Minutes passed. Then an hour. He shifted, fidgeted. His muscles twitched to move. His thoughts ran ahead to battles, to plans, to imagined enemies. But she just sat there, barely blinking, barely breathing. Not frozen, but fully here. Eventually she spoke. "You have trained to move without hesitation, but can you be still without resistance?" He said nothing. Fighting is easy when it's a reaction. Stillness is hard because it is a choice, and most warriors are afraid of what rises in silence. Ryan stayed, not because he understood, but because something about her presence quieted the noise in him. Each day he returned. They swept the yard in silence, boiled rice in silence, watched clouds drift in silence. She never explained, she never preached. But slowly, he began to feel the world differently. He noticed the pause between bird calls, the weight of the teacup in his hand, the way his own breath moved like wind through grass. The battlefield inside him softened, not because he defeated it, but because he stopped trying to. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." Sama did not teach with scrolls. She taught with her being. She showed that the fiercest warriors are not those who move fastest, but those who can stop without fear and meet the silence inside them. Rian returned to his training months later. His sword was no lighter, his steps no quicker. But those who faced him noticed something new. He no longer flinched, not even when provoked. His calm unnerved even the boldest, not because he had more power, but because he had less fear. And years later, when others came to him asking how he became so steady, he smiled and said, "An old woman once poured me tea and didn't speak for an hour." The old woman who taught stillness to warriors reminds us that the loudest strength is often not the strike, but the pause, the stillness that can see, feel, and choose, not from panic, but from presence. And when the world roars around us, it is not the sword that gives us peace. It is the quiet within, taught not through noise, but through a silence that holds everything and needs nothing. The moment that lasted forever. In a village where seasons moved like slow breath and time was marked by the ringing of ox bells and the opening of lotus flowers, there lived an old man named Datu who sold rice by the handful. He had no family, no title, and no rush in his steps. Children liked him because he always smiled without needing a reason. Elders respected him because he never offered advice unless asked. And even then, he answered more with silence than words. But there was one story no one could quite understand. They said that Datu had once experienced a moment that lasted forever. Not metaphorically, literally. A moment so complete, so still, that it never ended for him, not even now. Of course, no one believed it. "He's just poetic," they'd say, "or maybe just strange." But whenever he sat by the riverside and closed his eyes, there was something in the way he breathed that made people pause, as if the air around him had remembered something sacred. One day, a young monk came from a neighboring monastery to ask him about the moment. "Is it true," the monk said, "that you had an experience that never ended?" Datu looked at him and nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "but you won't find it by chasing it." "Then how did it happen?" Datu took a deep breath and began to speak, not like a man reciting a memory, but like someone describing a still lake he'd never left. "It was nothing special. I was sweeping my doorstep. The sun was warm. A bird sang from the roof, and for one breath, I stopped being the one sweeping. I stopped being the one listening. There was just the moment. No past, no next, no me. Just this soft, quiet now. And in that now, everything was enough. The monk waited for more. Some technique, a mantra, a secret teaching, but Datu only smiled. The moment ended for my body, yes. I finished sweeping. I went inside. But something in me never left. It stayed there, still sweeping, still listening, still inside that single breath. The monk frowned. But how do I stay in a moment like that? You don't, Datu said. The moment stays in you. The Buddha once said, if you can see the miracle of a single flower clearly, your whole life will change. Datu had seen not just the flower, but the space around it, the space where time rests, where being is enough without becoming. He never tried to recreate the moment. He never clung to it. That's why it stayed. He let it live as part of him, like the rhythm of his own heartbeat, quiet, unnoticed, but always there. Years passed, and Datu grew older, his step slower, his hair whiter, but his presence never dimmed. In fact, it deepened. People would sit near him just to feel what he no longer tried to explain. And many walked away with tears they hadn't planned to shed. The moment that lasted forever reminds us that enlightenment isn't always a grand event. Sometimes it's found in a single, ordinary breath taken without resistance. A moment that doesn't demand attention, but offers itself fully when we stop demanding something else. We are always chasing what's next, but forever lives here, in this sip of tea, in this sound of birdsong, in this breath that asks nothing but to be felt. And when we meet it fully, without rush, without clinging, that moment leaves a mark that time cannot erase. Not because we held on to it, but because we finally let everything else go. The moment that lasted forever. In a town where life was measured in hours and not heartbeats, where merchants opened their shops by the sun and closed them by the stars, there lived a watchmaker named Bo. He fixed time for a living. Clocks, sand timers, bell towers, anything that ticked or chimed, he could mend. And yet, he often felt broken himself. Despite all his skill, Bo was restless. Each day felt like a race he didn't remember entering. His thoughts moved faster than his hands. He feared missing something, regretted what was behind, worried what was ahead. His life was precise, but never present. One rainy morning, while repairing a grandfather clock in the back of his shop, something unusual happened. The final gear clicked into place. The second hand jumped once, and the entire mechanism froze. Not because it was broken, but because the room itself had gone still. No sound from outside. No footsteps on the wet street. Not even the rain tapping on the windows. Bo looked up. Everything around him had softened into silence. Time didn't stop, but it no longer rushed. And for a breath, just one, Bo felt everything. The worn wood under his palms, the smell of oil and brass, the quiet hum of his own breath in his chest. A single drop of rain sliding down the glass like a tear. Nothing else existed. Not the past, not the future. Just this. A moment so whole, so unshaken, it didn't need to continue to be eternal. He didn't move. He didn't name it. He simply sat inside the stillness, aware. Then, as gently as it arrived, the world returned. The second hand ticked. The bell outside rang. Footsteps passed. But Bo had changed. He walked to the window and watched people rushing beneath umbrellas, unaware that time had ever slowed. He didn't blame them. He had been one of them, and he knew now that what he had touched wasn't rare. It was simply forgotten, covered by noise, buried under thought. The Buddha once said, "When we are truly present, eternity is in the palm of our hand." Bo had repaired clocks all his life, but that moment taught him something the gears never could. That peace is not found in controlling time. It is found in stepping out of it. From that day on, he worked differently, slower, softer. When people brought him broken watches, he listened not just to the tools, but to them, their voice, their breath, their silence. Sometimes he fixed the watch. Sometimes he offered tea and said, "You don't need more time, you need less rush." He never told anyone about the moment that lasted forever, not because it was a secret, but because it could not be explained. It could only be entered. And those who sat with him long enough sometimes found themselves quieting without reason, feeling something shift without understanding why. The moment that lasted forever reminds us that not all eternity lives in lifetimes. Some of it lives in single breaths, in the space between thoughts, in the stillness we stumble into when we're no longer reaching. And once touched, it stays, not as a memory, but as a compass. A quiet knowing that whenever life becomes too loud, too fast, too heavy, we can return. Not by chasing peace, but by pausing long enough to remember it's always been here, waiting, inside this breath, inside now, the girl who breathed in mountains. There once was a girl named Amara, born in a village so high in the mountains that the clouds often passed through the streets like wandering guests. Her voice was soft, her hands always open to give, but her lungs were weak. From the moment she could walk, she struggled to breathe. Simple things, climbing stairs, chasing goats, laughing too long, would leave her doubled over, clutching her chest, as if her own breath were trying to run away from her. Doctors came and went. Some said the air was too thin. Others said she needed to move to the valleys far below. But Amara refused. "The mountains breathe me," she said once to her mother. "I just haven't learned how to breathe them back." People thought it was a poetic thing for a child to say, but she meant it. One day, a traveling monk arrived at the village. His face was lined with wind, his robe faded from sunlight. He didn't speak much, but when he saw Amara sitting quietly outside her home, trying to catch her breath, he sat beside her and asked a single question. "Do you breathe with effort or with trust?" She didn't know what he meant. She only knew that every breath felt like a battle, a tug of war between what she needed and what her body refused to give. The monk visited each morning after that. He never brought herbs. He never chanted over her body. He simply taught her how to sit, how to notice the air before it even entered, how to receive it gently, like an honored guest, not grab it like something owed. He spoke softly of the Buddha's words. Breathing in, I calm body and mind. Breathing out, I smile. Dwelling in the present moment, I know this is a wonderful moment. At first it felt useless. She still wheezed, still struggled. But she kept trying. And one morning, something changed. The wind moved through the pines in slow rhythm. A hawk circled overhead. The monk's voice was still, and Amara, for the first time, stopped chasing the breath. She simply allowed it. No forcing, no panic. Just being. The air came to her, not as a challenge, but as a gift, as if the mountain had finally said, "Yes, child, I've been waiting for you to stop running." And in that one breath, Amara felt something she had never known. Fullness, not in her lungs, in her life. She began practicing every day. With each inhale, she welcomed the mountain. With each exhale, she softened her grip on fear. Over weeks and months, her body grew stronger, not because the air changed, but because she did. She had stopped fighting her breath and started trusting it. The villagers noticed. She could walk farther, speak longer, laugh without coughing. But what amazed them most was the stillness in her eyes, like someone who had climbed much higher than any mountain around them. Amara didn't leave the village. She didn't become a nun. She simply became a living teaching. When others felt overwhelmed, they came to sit with her. She didn't fix them. She just breathed, slow, grounded, like earth itself exhaling. The girl who breathed in mountains teaches us that life cannot always be controlled, that sometimes the very thing we need, peace, breath, strength, only arrives when we stop grasping and begin receiving, not as demand, not as entitlement, but as presence. We spend so much time trying to pull life toward us, trying to inhale answers. But peace is not found in effort. It's found in allowing, in softening, in letting the world move through us without resistance. And sometimes the highest place we will ever reach is the quiet space inside one single surrendered breath. The laugh that ended all suffering. There was once a monk named Nima who traveled from monastery to monastery, hungry for understanding. He had read every sutra, sat through long nights of meditation, fasted, walked barefoot through harsh lands, and endured pain with a clenched jaw, believing that somewhere along the path he would finally arrive at a place where suffering could no longer reach him. But no matter how hard he tried, sorrow followed. He still felt anger when disrespected, still felt fear when alone, still woke in the night with the ache of questions unanswered. One evening, weary from the weight of his own seeking, he climbed to a remote mountain temple that few dared to visit. There lived an old master named Samton, who was said to hold no teachings, only presence. When Nima arrived, he bowed low and said, "Master, I have walked for years in search of freedom. I have studied the Eightfold Path, memorized the Four Noble Truths, practiced discipline until my bones ached. Yet suffering clings to me like a shadow. Please, tell me the final truth." The old master looked at him, nodded once and said, "Come, we'll eat first." They sat outside, sharing simple rice and pickled vegetables. The wind moved gently through the trees. No lessons were given, no answers offered. As they finished the meal, Samton looked up at the sky, then turned to Nima and asked, "Tell me, what does the sky worry about?" Nima blinked. I don't know. Nothing?" Samton smiled. "And what does the river regret as it moves past the rock?" "Nothing. It flows," Nima said. The master nodded again. Then why do you think you must suffer to become what already is? Nima frowned. Because the path demands effort. Suffering is part of the process. The Buddha himself, But before he could finish, Samten suddenly burst into laughter. Not a polite chuckle. A deep, raw, unfiltered laugh that echoed off the mountain walls like thunder and sunlight at once. The birds flew up from the trees. Nima stared, stunned. The master clutched his belly, still laughing. You think suffering is noble because it makes the journey feel real. You think pain makes you holy. And he laughed again, eyes glistening not with mockery, but with compassion. Something in Nima cracked. At first, he was offended, then confused. And then, without warning, he laughed too. A small sound at first, then louder, then uncontrollable. Years of tension broke like a dam, and he laughed until tears rolled down his face. Not because anything was funny, but because everything was. The years spent climbing ladders that led nowhere, the endless mental traps, the belief that peace had to be earned, the idea that enlightenment was far away. He saw it clearly now. The seeking had become the suffering. The Buddha once said, "There is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path." Nima had walked so hard trying to escape suffering that he never realized he was carrying it the whole time. When their laughter softened, Samten simply said, "You're free now, not because the pain is gone, but because you finally see it for what it is, a wave, not a prison." Nima didn't descend the mountain with more teachings. He descended with lighter feet, a quiet smile, and a presence that others felt before he ever spoke. When people asked him later what had changed him, he never said a word. He just laughed. And somehow, those around him felt something lift in themselves too. The laugh that ended all suffering reminds us that truth is not always solemn. Awakening is not always a struggle. Sometimes it's the moment we finally realize the absurdity of holding pain like a treasure, when all we ever needed to do was let go. Because sometimes the most sacred sound in the universe is not a chant or a bell. It's the sound of a soul finally laughing at the illusion it carried too long. The fisherman who cried for the ocean. In a small, salt-worn village by the sea, there lived an old fisherman named Rano, who had spent his entire life with the tides. From the time he could walk, he had been casting nets, mending boats, and reading the moods of the water better than he could read the sky. The sea had been everything to him, his work, his rhythm, his companion. But when his body grew old and his hands began to tremble, he could no longer sail out. The village built him a bench on the shore where he would sit for hours, staring at the horizon with the quiet ache of someone who had been asked to let go of the thing he loved most. And then, one day, for reasons he couldn't name, Rano began to cry. He did not wail, he did not sob. The tears simply came, soft and slow, like the tide itself. He sat on the bench, silent, while the tears rolled down his cheeks and into his beard. People passed by and tried not to stare. Some whispered. Some wondered if he had gone mad. One morning, a young monk traveling through the village saw Rano weeping and sat beside him. He did not speak. He just watched the sea with him. After a while, Rano, without turning, said, "I don't understand why I'm crying. The ocean is still here, but it feels so far away." The monk nodded gently and replied, "Sometimes the deepest grief isn't because something is gone, but because it is still here, and we can no longer hold it the way we used to." Rano's lip trembled. "I gave it my whole life, and now I feel like it's left me behind." The monk looked out at the waves and said, "What if it hasn't left you? What if it's asking you to meet it in a new way?" The old man shook his head. "I don't know how. I only know how to fish." The monk placed his hand on the wooden bench. "Then start here. Start by watching. Let the sea come to you now, not in nets, not in sails, but in stillness." The Buddha once said, "The sorrow which has no vent in tears may make other organs weep." And Rano had carried his sorrow in silence for too long. He had mistaken grief for failure. But the monk reminded him that grief is not a weakness, it's the final offering of love. So each day, Rano returned to the bench, not to fish, but to feel. To let the waves rise and fall without needing to pull anything from them. To let the ocean speak without needing to answer. He learned to receive, not with hands, but with presence, and something softened. The tears still came, but they were no longer heavy. They were light, like rain on open water. The grief did not vanish, but it became sacred, a bridge, not a barrier, a way of staying close to something he thought he'd lost. People began sitting beside him, not to fix him, just to be near him. And when asked what he was doing, Rano would smile and say, "I'm still fishing. I'm just casting my heart now." The fisherman who cried for the ocean reminds us that letting go does not mean we stop loving. It means we learn how to love differently, more quietly, more deeply, without needing to possess. Some of the most beautiful connections in life change form, but they never end. And when we stop trying to grasp them with the hands of the past, we may find they return to us in gentler ways, in breath, in memory, in tears that do not drown, but cleanse. Sometimes the sea leaves our nets empty so we can finally meet it without asking for anything, and simply let it wash through us like a song that needs no words. The stone that taught impermanence. On the edge of a worn mountain path where pilgrims often paused to rest and monks passed in single file without speaking, there sat a stone. It wasn't marked by carvings or sacred symbols. It wasn't polished or placed there by ceremony. It simply was, heavy, solid, still, as if it had always belonged to the earth. But the monks from the nearby monastery knew it by a different name. They called it the Changing Stone. To the eye, nothing about it changed. It looked the same year after year, grey, cracked, weathered by wind and time. But the monks had a quiet tradition. Each one, when sent on a silent retreat to the mountains, was instructed to sit beside that stone for 1 hour every day. No books, no chants, just presence. One such monk, a young novice named Riku, had recently arrived. Eager to gain insight, he followed the instruction exactly. On the first day, he sat before the stone and waited for a sign, a message, a sensation. Nothing came. The second day, he studied it, the texture of its surface, the moss growing in crevices, a small ant climbing across its face. Still, no great truth revealed itself. By the 5th day, he was frustrated. "This is just a rock," he thought. A thing that does nothing, that says nothing. What can this possibly teach me? That night, he returned to the monastery in silence, his thoughts loud. His teacher noticed the tension in his shoulders and said softly, "Stay longer tomorrow, and watch, not just the stone, but what moves around it." So on the 6th day, Riku sat again, and this time he did not stare at the stone itself. He widened his gaze. He saw the sun shift behind the clouds. He saw birds land and leave. He saw leaves blow past like whispered thoughts. A caterpillar crawled across the dirt. A flower nearby opened, closed, opened again. And then the insight came, not as lightning, but as a slow, clear warmth in his chest. The stone had not moved, but everything else had. He realized the stone's lesson was not in what it did, but in what it endured. It had witnessed 1,000 mornings, 1,000 rains. It had felt children's hands, the steps of the old, and the silence of those who had passed into death. It had seen everything change while it remained. And yet, it was changing too. Erosion, cracks, the wearing down of corners once sharp, moss growing thicker, insects burrowing beneath it. The stone itself had never clung to its form. It let the world shape it, slowly, patiently. It knew impermanence, and it didn't resist. The Buddha once said, "All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering." Riku began to understand. It wasn't about detaching from life or avoiding loss. It was about seeing clearly that nothing stays the same. Not grief, not joy, not pain, not love. Even the heaviest stone would one day be dust. And that was not cause for fear, but for freedom. After his retreat ended, Riku visited the stone one last time. He bowed, touched its surface, and whispered, "Thank you." Not because it had spoken, but because in its stillness it had shown him everything. Years later, as a teacher himself, Riku would often lead his students to the same path. He wouldn't point to the stone. He wouldn't say a word. He would simply sit and let them notice on their own. The stone that taught impermanence reminds us that truth does not always roar. Sometimes it waits in silence, in patience, in the ordinary. And the deepest teachings are not found in what changes quickly, but in what endures long enough to show us how everything changes, even the solid, even the sure, even us, the sand grain that knew nirvana. On the edge of a vast desert, where the wind sang through the dunes like an old lullaby and the sun painted everything in soft gold, there lay a single grain of sand named Sutta. Of course, no one had ever named a grain of sand before, but if any grain had deserved a name, it was this one. Sutta was smaller than a fingernail's breadth, lighter than a whisper, and hidden among billions of others. Yet, deep within him, there lived a strange stillness. While the other grains longed to be lifted by the wind, to join dust storms, to land somewhere important, on a crown, in a gemstone, on a holy altar, Sutta did not stir. Not because he was lazy, but because he was listening. He had felt the wind call him many times. He had watched other grains fly with pride. Some landed near oases and were stepped on by travelers. Some found their way into temples. Others were forgotten in corners, trapped in sandals or scattered across floors. They all had stories to tell, but Sutta never moved. Until one day, the desert itself asked him, "Why do you stay?" And the grain answered, not in words, but in stillness so pure that even the wind paused to listen. It was then that something incredible happened. Sutta disappeared, not vanished, but awakened. He did not leave the desert. He became the desert. The dunes, the wind, the silence, the heat, every grain, every ripple. He expanded into everything, and in doing so, he lost himself completely. And in that total surrender, he became free. At that very moment, far away in a monastery beneath a mountain, a young monk awoke from meditation with tears in his eyes. He turned to his teacher and said, "Something just dissolved inside me. I felt I was nothing, and yet everything." The teacher only nodded. "You brushed against nirvana." Sutta, the sand grain, had done what most souls spend lifetimes chasing, not by becoming more, not by traveling far, but by stopping, by surrendering the longing to be elsewhere and resting so deeply in what already was, that even identity melted like dew in the morning sun. The Buddha once said, "If you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you will have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will know freedom." Sutta let go completely. He did not need to rise to the sky or be held in a sacred bowl. His holiness was in the stillness, in not needing to become anything beyond what he already was. And in that moment, he taught the world a lesson no sutra could capture, that even the smallest, most forgotten speck of existence holds the doorway to nirvana. That no title, no temple, no journey is needed, only presence, only surrender. The sand grain that knew nirvana reminds us that awakening does not require greatness. It does not require movement. It requires the radical, silent courage to be here, fully, without reaching, without resisting, without hoping to be more. Because when we finally stop clinging to identity, to destination, to meaning itself, we don't disappear. We return to the truth that has never moved, that we are the breath, the ground, the sky, the silence, and even the sand. The river that flowed without water. In a forgotten valley between two sleeping mountains, there once lay a riverbed that had not seen water in 100 years. The land was cracked and dry. Stones lined the winding path where the current used to run. Locals called it the Ghost River, a place once full of life, now silent and empty. But something strange happened along its banks. Trees still bowed toward its course. Birds still circled above it. Animals still walked its path to rest. And the wind, when it passed through, made a sound like rushing water. Those who listened closely swore they could hear the river flowing, even though nothing moved. One day, a wandering monk arrived in the valley. He was old, quiet, and looking for a place to sit without disturbance. He followed the old stones, drawn by something he couldn't name. When he reached the heart of the dry riverbed, he laid down his robe, sat cross-legged, and closed his eyes. He did not ask why there was no water. He did not question the stillness. He simply breathed. And then he began to feel it, not with his skin, but with something deeper. The movement, the memory, the presence of something that wasn't gone, but no longer needed form. The river had not disappeared. It had only stopped carrying water. It carried something else now: stillness, listening, presence. A young villager came upon the monk days later. "Why are you sitting in the dust?" he asked. The monk opened his eyes slowly and replied, "Because the river is still flowing." The boy looked around, confused. "There's no water, just dry stone." The monk smiled gently. "Then listen again, not with your ears, but with your being." The Buddha once said, "It is not form that defines life, but the emptiness through which form moves." The monk had learned to listen where others only looked. He had learned to feel life in its most invisible form. People came to watch him, and slowly something began to shift. Those who walked the riverbed no longer rushed. They began to step softly. Some stopped to meditate, others to cry. The stones they once ignored became markers of peace. The dry bends became mirrors for reflection. And the river, though still empty, began to carry something again, not water, but awareness. It flowed through the hearts of those who had forgotten how to slow down. It washed over grief not with force, but with space. It reminded people that just because something is invisible doesn't mean it is absent. That sometimes, when form falls away, what is true finally becomes clear. The river that flowed without water teaches us that life does not always move the way we expect. Sometimes, what once rushed becomes still. What once filled our hands becomes something we can no longer touch. But that doesn't mean it stops flowing. Some rivers carry silence. Some carry presence. Some carry a kind of truth that doesn't ripple but rests. And when we stop insisting that life must look a certain way, we begin to see it again. In the empty, in the dry, in the quiet path where something sacred still moves, without sound, without form, and without needing to prove it's there. The hermit who forgot his name. In the highlands where the air grew thin and clouds brushed the tops of trees like soft cloth, there lived a hermit in a small wooden hut built beside a cold, clear stream. No one knew where he came from. He wore no badge of faith, no robe of distinction, no sign that he had once been anything else. He was simply known as the one who lives alone. And there was one curious thing about him. He had no name, not because he had chosen a spiritual title or shed his old one in some ritual, but because he had truly forgotten it. People who visited would ask, "What shall we call you?" And he would smile, wrinkle his brow in thought, and reply with calm honesty, "I don't remember." Some thought it was old age, others thought it was madness. But those who stayed in his presence long enough noticed something strange. The longer you sat with him, the quieter your own mind became, not because he silenced you, but because there was something about being with someone who had let go of being someone that made your own identity feel less urgent. One day, a traveling monk named Tendo climbed the mountain to meet the hermit. He had heard stories that the man had once been a great teacher, that he had renounced everything after a loss, that he had forgotten even the word I. The stories fascinated Tendo, but what pulled him more was a deeper question. What remains when you forget who you are? When he arrived, the hermit was sweeping the path with a handmade broom. Tendo bowed. The hermit looked up and nodded. "Do you truly not remember your name?" Tendo asked gently. The hermit shrugged. I suppose it stopped mattering. Weren't you someone once? A teacher? A man with a past? Maybe, the hermit said, but that feels like a dream someone else told me. Tendo stayed for 3 days. They ate simple meals. They spoke only when needed. The hermit asked no questions, offered no teachings, but everything he did was full of attention, from the way he drank water to the way he fed the birds by the window. On the 3rd evening, Tendo said, "Most people search their whole lives trying to find themselves. You've forgotten yourself completely. Isn't that terrifying?" The hermit smiled. "When I remembered who I was, I carried everything that came with it. Regrets, desires, labels, fears. When those memories faded, I thought I would disappear too, but I didn't. I only became quieter, lighter. The stream still flowed. The wind still came. The rice still cooked. Life didn't stop when the story of me did." The Buddha once said, "The self is a house built of thought. Knock on the walls and you will hear echoes, but knock long enough and the walls fall away." Tendo felt something loosen in his chest. For so long, he had tried to shape himself into a perfect monk, disciplined, wise, admired, but in trying to become something, he had forgotten how to simply be. On the morning he left, he turned to the hermit and said, "I still don't know your name." The hermit laughed softly. "Neither do I. And isn't that peaceful?" As Tendo descended the mountain, he realized the name he had worn. The identity, the pride, the roles were just clothes for the mind. Useful, maybe, but not who he really was. Beneath them, something wordless waited, something that didn't need a name. The hermit who forgot his name reminds us that the greatest awakening is not in becoming more. It's in needing less. In forgetting the story long enough to feel the silence beneath it. Because sometimes the deepest peace comes not from finding ourselves, but from finally letting go of who we thought we were supposed to be.